Chapter 1050. After a long period of experience, Weischer had concluded an objective pattern. All the former members of the Utopia were more or less seriously ill, not to mention the seniors who had already passed away. Those who were left behind were either a little or a lot of them. And the problem was huge. None of them were normal, including the non-staff member in front of him. When he mentioned that there was a show to watch, his eyes almost shone. Ahem, although we came here for fun as a guide, I should still advise you to pay attention to your safety, be wise, and return home in time. Seemingly aware of his gaffe, Odom coughed twice and tried to put on a very serious look. I can provide a safe shortcut to help everyone return to the present realm. Don't worry, it won't be long. By this time tomorrow, you can have lunch in London, although he said that the abstract expression of the snail was already filled with an expectant look of don't go, please. As a poor, weak, and helpless snail, Odom had fallen into a difficult struggle. On one hand was fun, and on the other hand was duty. The snail was really unable to choose. In the silence, he peeked at everyone's expressions, and everyone was also looking at Weischer. It was time to make a choice. But Weischer did not speak, just silence. He suppressed the urge to sigh. Sometimes he would hate himself for becoming a tool, but sometimes he could not help but want to become a carefree tool again. At least he did not have to face the consequences of his choice. If this was a game, he would have rolled up his sleeves and kept his mother. But this was not something as trivial as a game. If they lost a team battle, everyone would restart at the resurrection point, and they would only lose a little money. But in this place, which was 50 depths away from the present realm, once they lost, there would be no room for redemption. Professor Anton, who had great trust in him, Gregory, who had returned to hell after decades of herding sheep, Forster, who was originally living a peaceful life in the Iron Crystal, Raymond, and the Red Dragon, who were willing to sacrifice their lives for their companions. If he rashly advanced, everyone might die because of their own choices. But if they were to turn back just like that, where would their future and mission be? Sorry, I want to give it a try. Weischer sighed and told them, if you want to vote on this, I won't stop you. I have no objections. Forster raised his hand while smoking. I'm fine with anything. Anyway, I'm herding sheep everywhere. Gregory said, there's no difference. I still have loans to repay. Before Raymond could finish, he coughed awkwardly. If you don't mind another bad debt, I don't mind. Then let's do it. Anton put down the stainless steel coffee cup and said slowly, where in the world would you run away with your tail between your legs before the enemy comes? I'm already here. When he spoke, the old professor looked calm and tranquil like a retired engineer who was chatting with someone about where to go for a walk after supper. He lowered his head and peeled the shells of the melon seeds. His wrinkled and speckled fingers were as steady as a lathe. He pinched the thin and fragile kernels out of the cracks and threw them into the coffee foam. In the dense heat, the kernels floated silently and swirled with the undercurrent in the cup. It's time to make a decision. Weischer, Anton said, this is your responsibility. So, in this long silence, Weischer let out a long breath, and his expression gradually calmed down. Then let's move forward. Raising his head, he addressed the crowd. Everyone, please put the matter of luck to the back of your mind. There is no need to consider any path of retreat or stability, because I will put everything I have on the gambling table, including the lives of all of you here. No matter what happens, no matter how many enemies there are, our plan will not change, and our destination will not waver. If anyone tries to stop us, we'll crush their bones and bunkers together. As if he could see the endless enemies in the distance, Weischer announced softly, if hell wants to be our enemy, then we will fight to the death with hell. No one said anything. Only 4 of them raised their hands and calmly seconded the motion. From the moment they left the present realm, no, from the moment they accepted this mission, they didn't think about retreating. Either they succeeded and regained the afterglow of the past, or they died without a burial place and quietly disappeared in a corner. No matter which result was waiting for him in the future, Huaishur would gladly endure it. This is my answer to you, Mr. Odom. Huaishur said to the snail, "Next, it's your turn to fulfill your duty. I hope we can all fulfill our mission." Of course, of course. The water-embroidered snail waved its tentacles in ecstasy. It did not care about the hint of ridicule in Huaishur's words at all. Instead, it became even more excited. "I really didn't misjudge you, Mr. Huaishur. I can be sure that you are definitely a pillar of celestial genealogy." Huaishur was amused. Is being good at courting death also considered a pillar? I don't know about other genealogies, but in celestial genealogy, isn't this a great advantage? In Odom's opinion, Huaishur's behavior was definitely the most upright in the Republic. He might even be more upright than Russell. Wasn't that the group of guys who killed their way into the abyss back then like this? As long as they could not die, they would do it. They did not even blink when fighting with enemies dozens of times their own. They dug up the graves of rulers and blew up the ruins from dozens of eras ago. After blowing up and digging up, they even had to press the guys who came knocking on their door to the ground and rub them against the ground. It was either you die, or you die. They did not know how to compromise, avoid, or back down. For the sake of their own heaven, they did not hesitate to create more hells in hell. It even made the monsters begin to doubt who the real monster was. This was the so-called Republic. After so many years, Odom finally understood this familiar feeling again. He was so excited that his eyes were almost filled with tears. He was extremely glad that he had made the decision and foresight back then. Sure enough, no matter how boring it was, as long as it was related to the Republic, it would instantly become full of fun. At the thought of being able to sit in the VIP seat and witness everything from the beginning to the end, Odom trembled with excitement. His appetite increased, and he even ate 1 or 2 more dishes. The degree of deliciousness had greatly increased. Then, according to the contract, I will wholeheartedly provide all the services I can to all of you. Odom waved his tentacles as if he was bowing to the guests, until the end of the mission or the end of death. You don't have to say anything boring. Huaishur asked directly, "Where's my enemy?" Based on the current situation, in about 2 days, no, in 1 day, you will encounter the army of Blessed Land. But before that, in order to delay your advance, the corrupt order that is closest to Blessed Land has already mobilized a few of their armies to repair a new gate at the key entrance of Hell. Odom slowly moved on the table, the heavy metal in his body leaving a mercury-like trail wherever it passed, outlining the specific depth distribution map. It highlighted the city gates that were constantly being surrounded by enemies. If I'm not wrong, they will delay you here at all costs and wait for the main force to arrive. When the time comes, they will capture you in one fell swoop. As for the closest, its abstract expression became particularly subtle as it stopped in front of a city gate on the map. If you maintain this speed, you will see them in about half an hour. Then, should I congratulate them? Huaishur looked out of the bridge at the gray storm that covered everything, full of anticipation. After all, the prey is already in front of us. In the violent storm, a high-pitched cry burst forth. In the terrifying wind formed by endless dust and stone fragments, dozens of dazzling lights appeared. The pitch-black sunship used all its strength to prop up a deflection shield, crushing the ground and moving forward. Tearing through the storm, breaking through the barrier, they no longer concealed any traces of their movements. The surging waves of origin substance were like the fission in a furnace, radiating in all directions. Accelerate! In the huge space below the deck, accompanied by the continuous sound of metal scraping, the silent Nagas opened their arms and, with the help of mechanical arms, put on heavy armor and pulled down their masks. Behind the goggles, their eyes were cold and gloomy, revealing the light of killing intent. They were ready to go. Compared to the silence here, the workshop behind them rumbled endlessly. Under the shouts of the shamans, huge lizard beasts walked on the transmission pedals, following the tracks that were like an assembly line disappearing into the heavy doors and darkness. The sharp sound did not stop. Measuring, stamping, cutting, assembling, welding, loading, and fitting. In a short 3 minutes, the heavy steel that ordinary bodies could not bear covered their bodies. They were armed from the tail to the tip of the claws, and even the back with exaggerated heavy cannons. The armor formed by the cursed crystal alloy covered every inch of their skin, and the secret instrument from the primordial curse stimulated the most violent bestial nature, causing them to spit out blazing white mist from their mouths and noses. They felt unprecedented hunger and excitement, and they did not fear injury or death. The shamans walked between the arrays, waving the poisonous branches in their hands, loudly singing praises of the eternal ring, and sprinkling the blessed dew. In a short 15 minutes, the sun ship that advanced at full speed had already crossed the hell in front of them, breaking through the eternal storm. In the rumbling sound, the earth trembled. At the city gate, at the end of hell, the alarm had just sounded. On the Bloody Bone wall, the dazed hell creatures raised their heads and screamed. The slave workers who were building the wall under the whip froze in place, not even noticing the loosening of the suspension ropes and the pressure of the boulders. Soon, the sound of a bugle horn rang out. The smooth flow continued to cover the city wall, causing the gloomy white bone wall to shine brighter than gold and iron. Not only that, but cold light pillars rose from the ground like a cage, blocking the path in the air. When the boiling molten iron poured on the huge door that was dozens of meters tall, the final path was completely sealed. More and more boulders were piled up behind the door, desperately reinforcing the tortoise shell. They did not expect any achievements, nor did they intend to obtain any gains in the war. The group leaders guarding here made the wisest choice the moment they saw the sun ship. Send the message. Send the message immediately. The ghoul warlord turned his head and roared at the shaman. Tell them that the people who appeared are here. There was no need to fight. As long as they sent a message, there would be 6 legions supporting them at any time. Moreover, there would be a reward from the Holy Lord later. How could there be such a good thing in the world? The warlord rubbed his hands in ecstasy. This was a big win. This scale is a bit of a loss. On the bow deck of the sun ship, Huaisha looked into the distance, estimating the number of enemies in the city and sighing regretfully. It was not worth it. Behind him, the venerable elder knelt on one knee and solemnly swore, "Before sunset, I will take this place for you." Huaisha smiled and waved his hand slightly. "No need to be nervous, venerable elder. The sun will not set here today. Just do as you please. But before that," he paused and softly said, "let us light up the sun first." Following his words, the sun ship roared loudly, and a huge power burst out from the furnace of the engine, pushing the steel structure to slowly move. Sparks shot out from the joints of the steel. On the hull of the ship, the scalp-numbing cannon slowly lifted up and aimed at the city pass in the distance. Level 2 drive, origin substance filled. The process of qualitative change was activated. Then, with a thunderous heartbeat, Raymond, who was wrapped in countless cables, opened his eyes. His eyes shot out the same electric light as the cannon. Sun ship battle main cannon, Tears of Isis, fire. Chapter 10, 51. In that instant, Raymond's body quickly shriveled under the layers of coiling cables. The tall and sturdy giant instantly turned into a withered and shriveled corpse. However, under his chest, his heart was still frantically beating, bursting forth with an unprecedented deep echo. Countless cables were like bandages, wrapping around the steel skeleton and pulling him into the core of Sun's ship. The iron coffin-like engine cover rumbled open and swallowed him. Flesh and blood quickly spread on the steel, from inside to outside, causing the red dragon's roar to resound in all directions. An invisible tide shrouded the wasteland and even the city pass. It was a perfect circle with a radius of 10 kilometers, a precise and perfect mathematical miracle. Apart from Sun's ship that was enveloped by the circle, all living creatures let out mournful cries under the beating of the heart. Blood quickly seeped out from their noses and mouths, pulling at their souls. The invisible waves contracted inwards. On the city wall, countless slave workers and even guards fell like raindrops. The mournful souls merged into the storm and entered the engine. Immediately after, the cannon began to brew. After the third qualitative change of origin substance, those solidified souls had already completely transformed into pure origin substance in the furnace, radiating with a divine radiance. It shot out in all directions. Immediately after, endless flying sand assaulted their faces. It was as if in the blink of an eye, everything had arrived at the country beside the Nile River where the sun shone brightly. There was no sound of thunder, only the sound of waves and mournful cries from the yellow sand that assaulted their faces. The melancholic sound of a flute spread out from the reeds in the distance. The sound of the river echoed in everyone's ears. Under the illumination of the illusory sun wheel that appeared out of nowhere, Isis's tears flowed in hell. The tears of the compassionate goddess washed away everything. A line of gray and black extended forward in a perfectly straight line. Wherever it passed, everything quickly collapsed into gray and black mud, dissolving into the bottomless torrent and returning to the underworld river. The stench of decay and death descended in front of the cannon muzzle, regardless of whether it was the earth, the city pass, or even the city wall itself, as well as the guards who were affected. Everything was rapidly fading, merging into the gray and black color. Only the sluggish flow of sludge was left. Skeletons and aquatic plants emerged from the mud. In the past, when Alysus fell, Isis's tears turned into a torrent. The merciful river revealed its ferocity and covered the entire upper and lower Egypt, taking away countless lives to accompany her husband. At this moment, with Sun's ship as the fulcrum, the miracles of the past welcomed the reappearance of the miracles once again. Even if the power of this was less than a tenth of the true miracles, it was still enough to break through all the fortified cities and wreak havoc. Accompanied by the rumbling of the collapse, the city wall shook violently. A gap that was dozens of meters wide silently appeared on the towering iron wall. Below the gap, only mud was slowly flowing. The water of the nether river rippled again. The sun ship was moving above the river, rushing forward toward the ridiculous defense in front of it. He did not back down at all. Crash! Shockwaves sent rocks flying everywhere, and deafening noises that tore apart countless eardrums reverberated in this narrow space. Countless infernal realm soldiers were flung off the city walls and landed on the ground. In an instant, their bones and flesh were smashed to a pulp. Behind the collapsed city walls, the ferocious sun ship was still intact. From top to bottom, it cast a shadow of fear. On the bow of the ship, Huaishur overlooked all of this and said without turning his head, "Now, please bring me victory. I will not disappoint you." The elder raised his head and promised hoarsely. He stood up and drew his sword, roaring behind him. After the hatch was opened, the silent torrent had already been waiting for a long time. The scarlet eyes of countless Nagas were already glowing with a cruel light. When the heavy hatch on both sides of the ship was lowered, a steel torrent covered in frost surged out. When the brilliance of white phosphorus and iron gathered in one place, it surged like a blizzard, forming an avalanche that rolled forward. A bone-piercing chill spread. In the huge space of the ship's hold, a cold fire burned. Dozens of shamans surrounded the fire and fervently chanted praises. They tossed the corpses of their enemies into the fire in exchange for the Eternal Ring's favor. Soon, the favor from the deepest depths of infernal realm descended on the blades of the descendants, causing streaks of blood to quickly condense into crimson snowflakes. They soared into the air and quickly fell back down. The severe cold that could freeze an ordinary person to death in an instant did not kill the Nagas. Instead, it allowed their cold blood to burn without restraint, preventing their bodies from turning into charcoal. Death and winter descended on this narrow city pass. Paleness and blood quickly spread. In front of the advancing white phosphorus guards, the tough bodies and fearless fighting spirit that the ghouls were so proud of were of no use. The barely constructed terrain also instantly exploded and melted under the attack of the armored lizard's molten cannons. Unstoppable, forward! Under the heavy guard of his subordinates, the ghoul warlord finally woke up from his shock. He barely managed to dispel the chill and fear that had seeped into his bones, but the hand holding his blade couldn't stop trembling. Not good. If this continues, he didn't dare to think about it anymore. He turned back and roared, "Reinforcements! Where are the reinforcements?" They're almost here. The hunchbacked Ant Diviner trembled as he replied. They said, "They're on the way." In his daze, the warlord seemed to hear the chirping of pigeons among the clamor and shouting. Even the pale faces of the ghouls were burning red in anger. Damn it, what's the use of having them? Reinforcements that didn't arrive weren't reinforcements. Benefits that didn't reach their hands weren't F*King benefits. By the time they arrived, their corpses would already be cold. Why don't we retreat? His adjutant suggested in a trembling voice. But before he could finish, the warlord suddenly turned back and stared at him with his scarlet eyes. It was only when that face began to twitch in fear that the warlord coldly said, "We're lacking a supervisor in front. You go." The adjutant didn't dare to disobey. He raised his sword and charged forward with reinforcements, never to return. For a moment, the tent fell into a deathly silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to speak of retreat or surrender. It wasn't just the warlord's ferocity, but the Holy Lord's order. Once the Holy Lord was angry, just thinking about it made everyone's legs go weak. But in this silence, the loud noise in the distance became clearer and clearer, accompanied by a low, muffled sound. A blazing wave of air tore the tent apart and rolled up the torn leather. When the warlord looked up in shock, he heard a hoarse roar from afar. The venerable elder at the front had already broken into the innermost layer of the city pass with his men. This distance was completely within reach, and at that moment, the venerable elder also saw him. Behind the broken helmet, the scaly face curled up the corners of his mouth and smiled crazily. "Kakarona!" she shouted hoarsely. "Can you still keep up?" "Yes." The burly Naga panted and raised his large shield to block the javelin that whistled towards her. The venerable elder asked, "How many of us are left?" Kakarona turned back and hurriedly counted the personal guards behind him. He shouted, 16. "Okay, keep up with me. Tell me when there are 6 left." The elder held the cracked scimitar in his mouth and pulled out a heavy steel spear. He raised it high and swung it down violently, smashing the skull and helmet of the ghoul in front of him into pieces. Stepping on the bones, he charged straight into the formation that was advancing towards him. It was as if a huge rock had been thrown into the waves, splashing blood everywhere. With the enhancement of the armor and the mystic instrument, the curved steel spear swept across and violently defeated those who dared to stop her. However, one of the ghouls on the ground suddenly reached out and grabbed her leg tightly, trapping her for a moment. The spear broke. Then another ghoul pounced on her and stabbed the short sword into the gap in the armor without caring about its own safety. It pierced through the abdomen and protruded out from the back. The venerable elder roared. After crushing the ghoul on the ground with her foot, she stabbed the ghoul's throat with the broken spear and nailed him to the ground. Nailed to death. Then she blacked out. After a moment of absent-mindedness, she heard a mournful howl in the wind. The arrow had pierced through her eye socket. "Bastard, come and fight with me." She roared and violently pulled the arrow out of her eye socket. Ignoring the blood gushing out, she took out the scimitar in her mouth and stepped forward. "Take her down." The warlord grunted coldly and released the bowstring in his hand. He ordered his men, "I'm going to make a blanket out of her skin." Dozens of ghouls drew their swords and surrounded the venerable elder. But behind the venerable elder, her personal guards rushed forward without caring about their own safety and opened up a critical gap for her. The warlord pulled the bowstring again and aimed it at her head. The arrow whistled through the air, but this time the venerable elder's single eye stared at the warlord's movements. She raised her arm and blocked the fatal arrow. Her intact armor was torn apart by the terrifying arrow. Only her undamaged right arm was left, holding the broken scimitar tightly. She gritted her teeth, and her lips split open. Venom dripped down from the corner of her mouth and sizzled. Like a mad dog with a dead target, she charged forward. Gar Corona followed behind her and instantly felt the pressure around him increase. When he turned around, he realized that there were only 4 personal guards left behind them. They were not even enough to cover them and break out of the encirclement again. "Venerable Elder," he shouted in panic. The venerable elder did not turn around. Instead, he increased his speed and stepped forward. Ignoring the people who were blocking his way, he broke free from the broken armor that was protecting him and flew over this insignificant obstacle. She pounced on the enemy in front of her. "Die!" The warlord grunted coldly and released the arrow. The fatal arrow flew out again and sank into the venerable elder's face. But in the air, her body expanded rapidly as if she had transformed into a huge snake. Atavism. She closed her teeth and bit down on the 2 broken pieces of the arrow. The snake's eyes burned with a crazy light. The warlord froze on the spot. He only felt his vision turn dark. The mournful, cold light expanded rapidly and occupied his vision. Slash. Silently, amidst the clamor and shouts of the chaotic battle, the 2 passed by each other. The venerable elder rolled on the ground and staggered as she tried to prop herself up. She opened her mouth and violently vomited broken organs and blood. As for the ghoul warlord, he fell on his back, blood spurting out from his neck. A head rolled on the ground. The frightened face was still staring blankly, trying to see what had happened. But in the spinning world, the last thing he saw was the venerable elder's snake eyes. And behind her, on the pitch-black outline of the sunship, there was a figure coldly witnessing everything. The illusory light of the sunship enveloped that person. In the darkness that quickly engulfed everything, it became the last ray of light. At the last moment, he finally came to a realization. It's the sunship. For a moment, all sounds seemed to have disappeared. The sounds of fighting and shouting came to an abrupt end. In the dead silence, All the ghouls turned their heads in a daze and looked at the two figures surrounded by enemies in the deepest part of the city. The leader of the horde had disappeared. With Jacarona's support, the venerable elder gritted her teeth and raised the spoils of war in her hand. Still not surrendering, she roared hoarsely. The bleeding head dyed her face red, making it hard to tell whether it was the blood or her eyes that were more vivid. Countless Nagas roared, excitedly. The cold wave quickly spread and enveloped the entire city. The venerable elder supported her body with all her might. Even if all the ghouls around her crawled and surrendered or were hacked to death, she still did not fall. She only raised her head and tried her best to look into the distance, until the figure at the bow nodded slightly and turned to leave. She closed her eyes in satisfaction. Chapter 1052. Half an hour later, the last ray of light in the sky faded away. A crack suddenly opened up on the ground. Strange giant worms drilled out from under the earth's crust, opened their mouths, and spat out a pitch-black array that covered the entire city pass. Countless large groups of murderous soldiers were transported by the deep worms. After crossing two depths, in an instant, they descended into this endlessly stormy hell. But in the dead silence, all the soldiers sharpening their swords fell into an instant of sluggishness. Everything was silent. In front of him, there was no intense battlefield, no desperate slaughter. There were only ruins everywhere. The traces of frost had yet to dissipate, and the mud of the Netherworld River, which had melted countless corpses, was still emitting a pungent, poisonous gas. Even countless corpses, everything had ended long ago. What was left in front of all the reinforcements was only a ruin full of corpses, quietly exuding the aura of decay and death. Gone. Everything was gone. At the very front, the dark green plague cavalry froze where they were, looking at everything around them in shock. In the end, their gazes fell on the center of the city pass. It was a deep crack that penetrated all the defenses. It was as if a huge monster was trampling on the earth, approaching step by step, chiseling through the unreachable city pass. After violently crushing everything in its way, it went all the way to the end of hell. What was left was only a crack that spread to the end of the earth, and the storm, the hollow eyes of countless corpses had lost their luster, as if they were still staring blankly at these late reinforcements. Even the elite soldiers who had experienced hundreds of battles could not help but feel a chill down their spines. Were they here to hunt down the ascendants from the present realm, or had they accidentally barged into the hunting grounds of some strange monster? Where's the warlord here? Under the heavy armor covered in rust and dry blood, the Grand Knight took off his mask. His scarred face was full of ferocity. Soon his subordinates, who had gone deep into the ruins, brought back a shriveled head. This bunch of trash. The Grand Knight's 6 fingers tightened, and he angrily crushed the head. They can't even stall for time. What's the use of having them? But even so, he couldn't dispel the chill in his heart. Less than a minute had passed since they received the news. In other words, the Ghoul Legion, which had the geographical advantage, and were the best at defending, had been completely wiped out by the enemy. By the time they had arrived, the enemy had already left. The mess left behind was a mockery to those who came later. Not only were traces of God's mark inscriptions observed at the scene, but the other party even had super heavy siege weapons, no less than 5 Nagas and related equipment. How was this the group of jesters talking about a group of passers-by and a few celestial genealogy members who had nowhere else to go? This was clearly a large legion armed to the teeth, a super large bomb thrown into reservoirs and muddy ponds to blow up fish. If not for the fact that Utopia was long gone, he would even suspect that those lunatics had restarted the Hell development plan. Even with this, they still wanted to capture him alive. Are you kidding me? We found traces of their departure. They shouldn't have gone far. The returning sentinel reported in a hoarse voice, "Should we give chase, sir?" In a short silence, the Grand Knight did not speak. He just silently crushed the skull in his hand. After a long time, a chill appeared at the corner of his eyes. "Continue to search for traces at the scene. The rest of you, rest on the spot and wait for reinforcements." The Grand Knight coldly glanced at the rainbow light at the end of hell and sneered, since they overestimated themselves and wanted to break into the scar area and walk a dead path. Let them struggle in vain for a while. He did not punish them for their momentary anger and anger because of the traces at the scene. The Grand Knight was even unmoved. Coward? Could the art of war be called cowardice? This was called hiding one's claws and waiting for a good opportunity. No matter how fierce the charging formation of the Plague Knights was, and how tenacious their lives were, could they fight against that kind of super-large war weapon? Stop King joking. The sentinel nodded and sent a message to his subordinates behind him. Immediately, people scattered in all directions and went deep into the ruins to search for clues. There were also supervisors who drove the slaves and servants to clean up the empty space, set up camp, and boiled water to replenish the food of the plague soldiers and war horses. Only the priest who followed the army walked up angrily and asked coldly, "You are so lazy. Are you not afraid of incurring the wrath of the Holy Lord? Everyone is working for the church. Do you think you are the only one who is loyal to the Holy Lord?" The Grand Knight sneered. "How about this? I will immediately break camp and chase after them. When the time comes, I will let you take the lead because of your sincerity. How about it? I will also give you this credit without taking the slightest bit of it. If you agree, I will immediately swear to the wisdom of the devil that I will never violate it." The priest's expression twitched. His vertical pupils coldly glanced at him. After a long time, he did not speak. He flicked his sleeves and turned to leave. In the same place, the Grand Knight was also silent. He looked at the priest's back. It was not the first time that this old thing was in the way. This time, there were so many ghouls sacrificed at the scene. One priest would not be missing, right? Just as his hand was quietly pressing on the hilt of his sword, a loud sound suddenly rang out behind him. The cracks in the ground cracked open again. Another huge worm burrowed into the ground. Its huge mouth opened, and huge spiders covered in skeletal armor walked out under the control of a withered hand. On their gray skin, the blood-colored inscriptions bestowed by the Holy Lord were emitting a dark purple light. The strange fluctuations of the secret ritual shrouded their gray robes. After receiving the signal from the plague army, in less than half an hour, another spider spirit army that was originally sent to the War of Worlds changed direction and was sent here. Moreover, all of them were priests blessed by Bushuan. They were also equipped with giant white wind cannons and mutated behemoths that were dozens of meters tall. The importance that the banquet host attached to this matter was obvious. The Grand Knight's hand loosened the hilt of his sword and urged his horse to meet them. He had just taken 2 steps when he suddenly felt his mount sway. It was as if he had stepped on a crack in a stone, and he staggered. But when he lowered his head, he saw that the ground was slowly cracking open. Dust was jumping. Not far away, the huge worm began to twitch violently. It seemed that it could not wait to spit out the behemoths in its mouth and wanted to shrink back into the earth's crust. Then, golden sand floated down from the sky and landed under the Grand Knight's helmet. The wind blew the sound of tides in the distance, bringing with it the smell of mud and decay. "What is that?" The Grand Knight looked up in shock, but he heard thunder bursting out from the ground again. It came from the distance, and at the end of his sight, there seemed to be a mountain range pushing forward. A huge black shadow slowly rose, revealing a ferocious silhouette. "Holy! Holy! Holy!" Amidst the fanatical shouts and praises of countless kobolds, Sunship returned from the end of hell. Its sharp armor was covered in scarlet blood. It crushed the ground as if it was moving on the sea. The heavy bow of the ship opened up the ground and squeezed the soil, causing rough bulges and waves to appear on the ground. At the very front of the ship, iron chains were stretched taut. Under the violent whipping of the kobolds, the ghoul captives covered in wounds foamed at the mouth. They did not dare to slack off in the slightest as they exerted all their strength to pull on the chains and madly charged forward. It was unknown whether they were trying to pull Sunship forward or if they were afraid that they would be swept under the bow of the ship and crushed to pieces like the other ghouls. The day of destruction is coming. The day of destruction is coming. Bow down to Bahamut. The scorching sun rises from the abyss. Following judgment and destruction, we will live forever in death. Accompanied by the loud rumbling of the ship's advance, countless fanatical shouts and hoarse chants sounded. At the bow of the ship, at the very front, Weisher looked at the number of reinforcements and waved his hand behind him. Then, a fierce light appeared on the horizon. The trajectory correction was complete. The origin substance lock was complete. Super long-range attack. Isis's tear. Fire. Under the rumbling of the ironstone heart, the overflowing flood swept through the void and gushed out. In an instant, it crossed hundreds of kilometers and descended on the ruins. The overflowing flood of the Nile river-plowed through the earth along with the silt, forming a sharp angle with the original traces of the cannons. The deep worm was instantly cut in half. The massive skeletal spider and the white wind cannon, which had not been able to support it, were swallowed up by the silt and wailed as they were corroded and dissolved. They did not feel satisfied with the results of the battle just now. Sunship had left and returned. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! The sharp sound of bells burst forth one after another. The plague cavalrymen, who had just gotten off their horses, got back on their horses at the fastest speed in their lives under the orders of their officers and gathered. However, before they could form an organization, countless black dots appeared in the haze in the sky. The flying steel birds spread their wings and swooped down from the storm clouds. Under the support of the origin substance, their wings were wrapped in the glow of origin substance equipment. They crudely controlled the ghost's sacred mark and smashed into the ground as if they were going to die together. Waves of air swept across. After 3 rounds of Iron Crow's bombardment, smoke rose up. The giant beasts struggled fiercely, and the ruins had been completely razed to the ground. From time to time, the metal bombs buried in the battlefield and ruins would be triggered, bringing another casualty to the plague cavalrymen. That group of people from the Discovery realm, the Grand Knight looked at the end of his line of sight in a daze. His face twitched. It was unknown whether he was furious or shocked. The sword hilt in his hand was almost twisted out of shape. How dare they? How dare they? After breaking through the blockade, they did not escape. Instead, they turned back and started a second round of war. They actually dared to face the corrupt order head-on. Ignore the wounded. Everyone close to me. Gather, gather. In anger, the Grand Knight roared. Dark green flames rose from his armor. The plague giant beast under him roared and trampled on the ground. Let this group of people from the Discovery realm have a taste of our power. In a few short moments, the plague cavalrymen who had been attacked regrouped again. They covered the dozens of giant spider spirits and the remaining giant beasts and launched a counterattack in the direction of Sunship. Rings of light descended from the sky and blessed their bodies. A large group of energy gathered, causing the Grand Knight's strength and body at the front to rapidly increase. The long sword in his hand that the banquet master had given him lit up with a purple-red glow. It greedily extracted fresh blood and origin substance, bringing about a solidified qualitative change that belonged to the plague domain. The enemy has launched a counterattack. On the bow of the ship, Huaishir turned around and looked at the snake man who was half kneeling on the ground and waiting for orders. "Can you still fight for me, esteemed elder?" he asked softly. "Can you still fight?" Of course. The esteemed elder nodded. Even if he had just experienced a tragic battle and suffered heavy injuries, his face covered by bandages and stitches did not waver at all. Blood seeped out of the wound. The leader of the group, who was covered in wounds, knelt on one knee and replied sincerely, "I will serve you until you order me to stop." "Very good." Huaishir nodded and reached out his hand to press her face. "Then go. Go and ask Hell to mobilize its army. I did not come here for peace." Under his 5 fingers, a miserable shriek burst forth. The bandages and stitches were quickly torn apart, and the broken scales were rapidly falling off. What replaced them was flesh that was rapidly healing and blood-red crystallized scales. For the first time, he bestowed a blessing from Great Sea Ming to a creature of Hell. The killing intent that targeted Hell and all solidified things circulated in the esteemed elder's body, violently modifying her soul and body. Under the cover of Bahamut's shadow, the pure and majestic divinity circulated, bringing endless power. It was as if a fragment of the sun had descended on her soul. The eye sockets that had blinded her shot out a blazing light at this moment. More blessings appeared from the white-scaled guards and the undead army behind her. The gate of the ultimate opened, and the flock of crows swept in. They turned into origin substance and attached themselves to their bodies, bringing them the miracle and power of ghosts. They were all pulled into their flock, becoming an extension of Great Sea Ming. When Huaishir raised his hand again, a crisp, cracking sound could be heard. The old dead skin was shed, the huge wound healed, and the broken limbs returned to their original form. Under the blessings of Great Sea Ming's divinity, a complete transformation was ushered in. The esteemed elder with 4 arms and a snake tail slowly propped up her body, and sharp bone blades grew out from her forearms. Ash-white hair fell from her shoulders, bringing with it the unique coldness of the Nagas, like dancing snowflakes. Biting cold air spread out. "As you wish." She raised her sharp finger and blinded what was left of her right eye without hesitation. The light that burst out from her left eye became even more violent. It was so dazzling that no one could look at it directly. The new crown wearer grinned and smiled ferociously. "I will bring destruction to them." Chapter 1053. Relying on the divinity and blessings from the Great Sea Ming after being reborn 16 times and experiencing 10,000 battles, the venerable elder finally crossed the natural chasm between the purgatory mortal body and the blessed devil, completing a qualitative leap. Tracing back, awakening the blood of disaster inherited from the Ring of Eternity, she grasped the cycle of death and revival, mercy, and cruelty. After she made the prompt decision to tear her right eye, the blood of disaster from the merciful mother merged with the miracle bestowed by the Great Sea Ming in her left eye. Mercy and love for the young descendants, cruelty and brutality toward the enemy. The essence of the Ring of Eternity was manifested through the miracle and disaster on both sides of the Ring of Eternity, forming a new source of power. This was the loyalty of entrusting one's soul to the ultimate. At this moment, the venerable elder had already become the crown bearer of Huaishir's group. After expressing her loyalty to Huaishir in the most direct way, the venerable elder didn't waste any more words. She instantly soared into the sky, like a giant snake swimming in the sea, controlling the tide of frost to circle around the sun ship 3 times. Wherever she passed, the bone-deep frost shrouded the bodies of the white-scaled guards and the undead army, covering their armor and bodies with a layer of thick ice scales that took root in their flesh. In the most direct way, it stimulated the tyrannical nature in their bodies, causing their eyes to burn red as they roared and howled. The ecstatic priests loudly sang praises, splashing the blessings from the ring of eternity, causing the precipitation of hell in their blood to rapidly heat up, bringing with it an even more violent power. In that instant, the gates on both sides of the sun ship opened with a bang, and a frozen white flood rushed out from within, chasing after the venerable elder. Without any avoidance, retreat, or hesitation, they collided with the plague cavalry of the Order of Corruption. The sharp sound of expanding steel drowned out the roar of the storm, and in an instant, blood spurted out from the pale white and dark green. Then, the elite plague cavalry broke through the blockade of the undead army like a hot knife cutting through wax. It was just that their formation was slightly scattered. But then, the white-scaled guards at the back forcibly withstood the secret attacks of a dozen giant spider spirits, and the bombardment of the damaged white wind cannons, blocking the plague cavalry and erecting an iron wall. The heavy shields in their hands had long been modified by Gregory into embedded armor-cutting plates, forcing the plague cavalry to take a detour. The giant lizards on both sides carried the molten cannons on their backs and began a frenzied counterattack. The crows in the cannons screamed excitedly and were ejected by the force of the explosion. Like riding on a roller coaster, they screamed nervously and excitedly before being smashed into the enemy formation. A new game. In the center of the battlefield, there was already a turbulent airflow converging, forming a tornado-like airflow. The venom-soaked Great Elder was flying down the Great Seeming Grand Elder. Under the Grand Knight, the spectral warhorse soared in the sky. It was not inferior to the nimbleness of the venerable elder's snake body. The large number of soldiers under his command did not discourage him. Instead, the countless knights of plague who had died in battle turned into souls and surrounded him, attaching themselves to his armor and forming strange faces that screamed in pain. His sluggish eyes were filled with vicious curses as he looked at the revered elder. Every line of sight carried an origin plague brewed by the host of the banquet, enough to cause the wearer's body to fester and fall ill. And then there was nothing else, such a weak poison. The elder's bone blade slashed down, and the light in his single eye surged. How can you surpass the strength of our steel? Among her scales, countless weird flowers and sticky colors were rapidly expanding and growing, devouring the plague that was delivered to her door. Immediately afterwards, they began to emit origin substance tendrils filled with anger, pain, hatred, regret, and all sorts of malicious intent. They were like strange wings, dancing spasmodically, wrapping around the elder's body, forming an activation spell outfit that was not inferior to the plague armor. It was so strange and ferocious, but at the same time, it was extremely holy and solemn. It was as if the messenger of the gods had descended here. It bloomed with boundless light. What the hell is this? The Grand Knight who had originally held the advantage only felt his body rapidly become sluggish, and an indescribable chill appeared in his heart, through the eye of crazed desire that was strengthened by the secret instrument of the demonic wisdom. He could easily see the essence of this power. It was also because of this that he felt a chill all over his body. The blazing illusory light was just an appearance. The true essence was the endless shadows hidden behind the light. What was dazzling was not the light, but the deep and strange darkness that was enough to stab all eyes. The shadow of the ultimate was like the sun, radiating from her body and almost covering the entire battlefield. It so generously spread anger, pain, regret, sadness and resentment to all souls for a moment, he almost suspected that the person standing in front of him was a priest of Boishuan. But the brutality and greed that seemed to want to devour everything and turn all living things into food seemed like a shepherd blessed by a rancher. But wasn't the power that caused a large group of people to solidify and distort in an instant and fall into madness the favorite method of the Pied Piper's jester? But this was clearly a damned snake person. When did the Eternal Ring have such a good relationship with the element of destruction? In an instant, countless contradictory characteristics and discoveries made him fall into confusion, unable to understand. Was this enemy an ascender from the modern realm, or a damned monster from the dark abyss? There wasn't enough time for him to think carefully. The Grand Knight roared, and his sword flashed with malice as it slashed down, instantly forcing the elder to retreat. Not only did this advantage not make him feel excited, but his heart also turned cold. Not long ago, his sword was enough to cut through the elder's bone blade and leave a heavy wound. But now, it could only leave a mark on the new bone blade and force the opponent to retreat temporarily. It wasn't that the opponent had become stronger. It was that he had become weaker. The formless darkness had already wrapped itself around his body like greedy tentacles, sucking away at his origin substance and calamity energy as if they were trying to break his bones. The ferocious faces on the armor quickly calmed down. It was as if they had been purified by the holy light. Their fierceness was no longer there, and a blissful and intoxicated figure appeared in their empty eyes. Some of them even began to loudly sing praises with the kobold. They quickly disappeared from the armor and appeared around the venerable elder, impatiently plunging into the eternal darkness. They burned away in the flames, leaving behind only the remnants of the malice. There was no longer any contamination. What's wrong? The elder instantly appeared in front of him amidst the frosty wind, smiling coldly. Where's the power you're so proud of, reveler? The bone blade slashed down again. This time, a hateful glow appeared on the bone blade, and the scarlet blade collided with the demon sword, causing sparks to fly. Countless crow cries rang out from the Grand Knight's soul, causing his vision to go black. Where's your plague and origin substance poison, reveler? The Naga roared, her pale, white hair fluttering in the wind, spreading a bone-chilling cold that froze everything. Show me your true strength, sinner. Show me the courage you used to challenge my master. Or else, a tremendous power emerged from the bone blade, out of nowhere. Even the bone blade was unable to withstand the majestic power and fell apart. Meanwhile, the Grand Knight was almost unable to hold onto his sword. His arms went numb, and he was sent flying. However, the evil chill of death followed closely behind him, like a shadow. The sharp bone blade regenerated from the elder's wrist with frost. The Naga's face was right in front of him, and the illusory light in her single eye was piercingly cold. Present your head to my master. At that moment, the Grand Knight felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. He gripped his demon sword tightly without hesitation and shouted hoarsely, praising the king of the feast, praising the incarnation of hell that possessed all desires and depraved wisdom. He didn't hesitate to tear his own soul apart and offer it as a sacrifice. A black-purple glow erupted from the demon's sword once again, and a dark compound, formed by countless eyes, flashed in the reflection of the sword's spine. The blessing from the deepest part of hell had arrived. Under the authority of the feast master, all living things were corroded and decayed. All the strongest and sharpest forces were quickly blunted and fragile under the endless desire. They were as fragile as glass. In an instant, the elder's arms were easily cut off. From the shoulder to the abdomen, most of her body was split open by the blade. But in the spurting blood, the the blade stopped abruptly, under the grip of a pair of palms. So, weak. The indulgence curse from the king of the feast master failed to devour the elder's soul. Instead, it made her more violent in the pain of her soul. 2 hands were cut off by the demon sword, but there were still 2 hands. They had seized this critical moment and held the Grand Knight's wrist tightly. Through the thick and heavy armor, he tightened his grip and crushed the steel like it was mud, leaving behind deep fingerprints. The blade of the chopping sword was stuck, no matter how hard the Grand Knight struggled. The strangely long snake tail wrapped around the Grand Knight's body and the warhorse and quickly contracted. Then, with the dull sound of blood flowing and flesh bonding, the huge wound was quickly closed under the suture and pull of the revitalization spell. 2 brand new arms were quickly regenerated from the crack. It's time. In the storm close at hand, the elder's twitching face showed a grim smile, and the fierce light in her one eye was violent. The regenerated palms reached for the Grand Knight's face little by little, clinging to the sides of his head. Under the helmet, the Grand Knight seemed to understand something. His eyes widened in horror, and he opened his mouth to roar and roar. But then there was a scalp-numbing friction sound. The neck guard at the connecting part of the helmet and armor quickly cracked, and the steel screamed. The Grand Knight's head was slowly turning, little by little, unshakably, toward the back. Crack, 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 crack. 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles. The storm was quickly dissipating, and the roar and whine gradually blurred. In the end, only a frightening dull sound was left. It was like twisting a light bulb from a lamp holder. There was a snap. In the horrified eyes of all the plague knights, the ripe melon fell, the plague warhorse whined, and was sucked dry by the revitalization curse tentacles. And the Grand Knight's remaining corpse was lifted by the elder's 4 hands, violently pulled and shattered. Plague blood gushed out and fell into the elder's mouth. Not a single drop was left. After doing all this, she didn't pay attention to the cursed sword that was still stuck in her chest. She flew over the battlefield and landed on the deck of Sunship. She respectfully crawled on the ground and raised the head in her hands. She offered her spoils of war to Huaishur. "You've worked hard." Huaishur nodded and examined the Grand Knight's head. "It's not a bad material." In the elder's hands, the expression of the head constantly changed, as if it wanted to angrily rebuke the enemy in front of it. But when the darkness behind him slowly rose, the anger and killing intent quickly dissipated, and unconcealable fear and despair flowed out of his eyes. In the flames of the forging furnace, the miserable scream sounded again, and the alchemy fire swallowed everything. Bear with it. Huaishur reached out and grabbed the hilt of the sword in front of the elder's chest. Ignoring the curse of desire wrapped around it, he violently pulled it out along with most of the elder's soul. The elder gritted her teeth and suppressed the urge to scream, but her huge body couldn't help but tremble and twitch, once again feeling the pain of her soul being torn apart. In Huaishur's hand, the demonic sword suddenly released bursts of strange purple-red light. Countless tempting illusions and moaning sounds appeared, but soon after, the phantom of a furnace enveloped it, and pure destruction descended upon it. The angry roar of the host of the banquet sounded from the void, and then quickly disappeared. The desire to erode and disintegrate everything, and great Si Ming's divinity began to fight in the flames, but soon, under the violent suppression of the ultimate, this fragmented curse was eternally melted into the darkness. And then the forging began. The resounding sound of crystals multiplying came from the furnace, and molten iron surged like flowing mercury, covering it and completely destroying the original outline. In Huaishur's hands, the demon sword quickly melted, and in the end, only the pure calamity crystal was left, emanating waves of ferocious aura. Although it's a little rough and lacking in maturity and foundation, it's still useful. Huaishir held the hilt and pointed it at the crack in the elder's chest. It's yours. The blade pierced down. In an instant, the animated molten iron swiftly drilled into the crown wearer's body like a snake, spreading to every inch of his flesh. Deep into the bone marrow, the lost soul returned with new power. However, this gift and reward was too tyrannical and too great. Under the horrifying heat, the elder could no longer endure the pain in his soul and roared out loud, convulsing violently on the ground. Soon, under the cover of frost and freezing air, the high temperature of the furnace quickly dissipated. The huge crack in the elder's chest had completely disappeared, and in its place was new flesh that glowed silver. Not only did the crack heal, but under the skills of nirvana transformation and biological rebirth, this power was fused into the elder's soul and bone marrow. Countless metal-like nerves connected to the new organs, forming a new cycle. Lines of steel patterns appeared on the scales, wrapping around her huge body, and finally forming an iron crown on her head. When the elder raised his arm again, the curved bone blade oozed out a sticky shadow that was far stronger than the plague blood. Endless malice converged to form a curse. Unbelievable! Such terrifying power. Take it as a congratulatory gift for your advancement. Huaishir smiled and expressed his gratitude, and then took a last look at the battlefield below. I'll have to trouble you with the rest. Please leave it to me. The elder replied respectfully, and that figure had already turned and left. Chapter 1054. In a quarter of an hour, all the plague knights were slaughtered to the last. Half an hour later, the countless kobolds that covered the mountains and plains finished their search. They excitedly pushed carts and took away everything that was shiny, hard, or could even scrape off a bit of iron powder. They threw a large number of skeletons into the charcoal fire and threw the spoils of war into the furnace. Amidst the fanatical praises, pairs of eyes were illuminated by the furnace fire, causing the black fur of the kobolds to be covered in a layer of red light. An hour later, the sun ship rumbled into the distance, and the ruins returned to silence. An hour and a half later, the sky shattered, and countless black dots fell from the sky. A desolate storm blew from afar, bringing with it the wails of the remnants of hell and the mockery of those who had left. This time, no one dared to slack off or be careless. They advanced step by step. The army of hell was extremely vigilant, on guard against the attack of the sun ship at all times. The light of the large-scale, secret ritual shrouded the sky and earth. But even after 2 hours, there were still no signs or traces of it. Amidst the whistling of the wind in the distance, the rulers of the two armies looked at each other, unable to hide their gloomy expressions, and even unconsciously relaxed and rejoiced. Maybe that group of people from the present realm had really left, right? Left. On the altar, in the huge bronze mirror, there was a gorgeous and eerie palace, as well as a strange figure wearing a thin veil on the throne, looking down at his subordinates who were crawling under the stairs. His gaze was as if he was looking at 2 lumps of incombustible garbage that had suddenly fallen in front of him. It was filled with incomprehensible surprise and confusion. The host of the banquet pondered for a long time and finally seemed to understand what had happened. In other words, there were so many of you, a total of 5 legions, but not only were you unable to stop them, 3 of you were even killed. And then you just let them leave like that. He made a gesture of flapping his wings and repeated, "Left." None of the leaders of the reinforcements dared to speak. They just remained silent and crawled on the ground, trembling. In the silence, the host of the banquet held his chin and pondered for a long time. Suddenly, He came to a realization and couldn't help but pat the chair and laugh. Ha ha, this joke is really good. I like your sense of humor. I admit that I was a little scared by you guys just now. You bunch of clever brats, always coming up with new tricks for me. All right, I'll stop joking around. Where's the little cutie I want? He looked up expectantly and said, Hurry up and bring him here. Let me see if you've heard him. In the dead silence, there was still no one speaking. The subordinate who was crawling on the ground was sweating profusely. Cold sweat dripped from his forehead and fell into the dust. He could feel the gaze that fell on him gradually becoming heavy, and it was filled with a coldness and malevolence that made him shudder. There was no more hope. You're not joking? The smile on the host's face gradually disappeared. The subordinate swallowed his saliva with difficulty and nodded. Then why are you bunch of trash still alive? The wine cup in the host's hand gradually changed shape. The wine that was brewed from endless desire and thirst fell to the ground, wriggling like a living creature and making sizzling noises. Damn it, 3 legions! After 90 years, after being promoted to ruler, the host once again experienced a long-lost rage. More than 6 legions that were fully equipped with war weapons were all killed by a group of people from the present realm. Even if it were 3 legions of pigs, they wouldn't be able to kill them all in 2 days, right? In the bronze mirror, the furious host of the banquet threw out the wine cup in his hand. The bronze mirror shook violently, and the pinched cup broke through the air and smashed into the army overlord's head with a loud bang. Half of the army overlord's head was instantly blown away, and his entire body was sent flying away. But soon, the lord got up again. He didn't even dare to treat his upper body. He crawled back like a dog and kowtowed crazily. He wanted to cry but had no tears. I didn't expect it either. Holy Lord, we've already sent reinforcements as fast as we can without any delay, but who would have thought that the people in front would be so fast for nothing? This matter really couldn't be blamed on him. After receiving the news, he rushed over and didn't even have time to drink a mouthful of water. But who would have thought that he didn't make it in time? Who else could he blame? The trash in front was already dead. Could he pull them out of the furnace and whip their corpses? Now, there was no dust. Someone had to take the blame and be responsible for this. In hell, there was no such thing as limited responsibility. Instead, it was a cruel military punishment. A fair and just trial would never exist. Only the joy and anger of the superiors dominated everything. He hated those bastards to death in his heart. It was fine if they died, but why did they have to drag them down with them? But now, he had to take out something, even if it was just a little harvest. He had to quickly divert the Holy Lord's attention. Otherwise, he would really be demoted to the slave army, a survivor. He was quick-witted, and his eyes lit up. We also found a survivor. There's still a guy alive. He must know something. In the long silence, a cold gaze quietly looked at him. After a long time, the host said, "Bring him up." Soon, the sound of galloping horses was heard. With a tragic cry, an iron cage was dragged over. When the door of the cage was opened, the ghoul, who was almost on his last breath, rolled out. He whimpered and panted with difficulty. He was convulsing and trembling. It could be seen that those people treated him very well. They even bandaged and treated his wounds as if they were afraid that he would die. They even used bandages to tie a huge bow on his head. Now, the bow had long been dyed red with blood. It became more and more festive and funny. The host of the banquet glanced at it coldly and returned to his throne. His fingers tapped on the back of the chair impatiently. "Are you mute?" The army overlord kicked him. "Speak." The ghoul curled up on the ground. twitching. He tried to open his eyes and look around. Finally, he mustered his courage and looked at the projection of the ruler on the bronze mirror. That person, he said. The ghoul's tears flowed. He asked me to bring you a message. The host's expression froze slightly, and he raised his eyebrows. He said, while choking, the ghoul began to twitch violently. It was as if something was rapidly growing and expanding in his body, greedily devouring his soul and internal organs, dominating his will. It was as if molten iron was flowing out of a furnace, causing its eyes to emit a dazzling radiance. Through the ghoul's eyes, it cast a cold glance at the ruler. A low and calm voice sounded from its throat, conveying the words from Huaishur. It was full of tiredness, disgust, and 120,000% impatience. He said, "It's about time." At that moment, the intense light in his eyes finally turned into flames. It spewed out from his mouth and nose, rising rapidly and completely burning the ghoul. But in his chest, under the sutures, an iron wolf finally moved to the last grid. There was a crisp sound. Ding! It was as if a tuning fork had been struck, causing another tuning fork buried deep under the ground to resonate. Like the lingering sound at the end of a movement, the ground began to wriggle like the waves of the sea. Hell trembled. Fissures appeared out of thin air on the bulging ground. What rose from within them was an intense light of destruction. With 2 whole legions as the materials, the fury of Ramses gushed out. Hundreds of tons of metal explosives were scattered under the ruins, and a huge explosion cycle was formed by secret instruments and iron wires. Above a small spark, the burning sea tore the earth's crust apart and reached out to the sky. Embrace hell. What followed was endless darkness. In the center of the explosion, a pitch-black bullet quietly disintegrated, and the solidified divinity from Great Sea Ming flowed out. In an instant, it covered everything, eroded everything, and dissolved everything. It devoured everything that was covered by the shock wave. When the earth-shattering shock swept through, the original ruins were gone, along with the 1.5 legions stationed around. Only a deep crater was left. The flawless and smooth walls formed a hemisphere of Tiancheng, and in the center, on top of the remaining stone pillar, there was only a cracked bronze mirror left. The gravely injured feudal lord crawled on the ground and coughed violently, spitting out his internal organs and blood. He did not dare to moan. He could only kowtow to the bronze mirror and beg frantically. On the cracked mirror, the host of the feast did not speak. She only looked down at everything silently. After a long, long time, she sighed faintly. "Tell me, why did I raise a bunch of trash like you?" In the mirror, there was a boiling voice. It was as if some kind of sticky, gelatinous substance had torn apart the container. The surrounding shamans screamed in horror and fled. The host of the feast's body was rapidly expanding. Dozens of big mouths filled with sharp teeth slowly opened on her gorgeous and strange face, and swallowed all the living things in the entire hall, until finally in the darkness there was only a furious gasp. "Mobilize all the legions and manpower in the nearby depths." Dozens of screams overlapped and turned into an ear-piercing roar. "Chase after her." Counting the time, our gift should have been delivered, right? On the bridge of the sun ship, Huaishur glanced at the time on the screen. "I wonder how the reaction is. It's just as you expected." Water-embroidered Snail, who had been admiring the ultra-high-definition image in the front row, said, "The child is very delicious and likes the food very much." After the host of the feast received it, she was moved to tears. "An excellent counterattack and warning," Odom concluded. "According to my observation, many people who heard the news and wanted to take advantage of it have already retreated. It can be predicted that in the next few days, we will get a rare period of peace. But as a price, it paused for a moment and said softly, next, there will definitely be more severe storms, right? Chapter 1055. Violent Storm? Why sure moved her gaze away from the depth map, and it was as if she had heard a joke. A rainstorm like this? Do I need to buy an umbrella? This is just the beginning. Odom said, there are more people with chips in their hands who haven't entered the arena yet. Don't forget, compared to the real casino in the reality, we might just be a slot machine. The heavyweight gamblers aren't interested in such small fights. The Battle of the Worlds is the stage they are looking forward to. Weisher was curious. If it's just these, how can it be considered a violent storm? If I remember correctly, you are only grade 3? Can all grade 3 in the reality be like you? Odom said, even if they are rulers with authority, there are still differences between them. Oh, I know this. There are big bosses like the Withered King, and there are also rotten dreams. Weisher suddenly understood. Speaking of which, who is the host of the feast? Because he is a new ruler in the past 100 years, not many people know the details. Limited by time, he was not able to do anything in the dark abyss. However, his authority, the eternal carnival, should be infinitely close to the power of demonic desire. He is a seed of the abyss hatched by Bushuan himself. He is known as Bushuan's youngest son, his beloved embryo. Although his sphere of influence is narrow, he has a lot of good things given by Bushuan. Speaking of this, it paused subtly for a moment, as if looking somewhere else. It seems that he was provoked by you and smashed a lot of things just now. He has a bad temper. How is it my fault? Why sure didn't care? Where were we just now? Ruler, Odom said. Sometimes the existence of a ruler represents the group itself, but there must also be the existence of brothers and sisters. Just like the respected elder who served you, the crowns under the ruler are an extension of their will. Similarly, sometimes the strength of the brothers and sisters depends on the master they are loyal to. Some people were crowned because they were not strong enough, and some people are crown wearers because their bosses are too strong. Not only are there differences between rulers, but even the crown wearers are also very different in terms of strength. Odom sighed helplessly. Look at me. Even if I'm the leader of a horde, I can't even defeat a kobold. I'm a disgrace to all creatures of hell. Is that so? Weisher was slightly surprised. That's right, that's right. Odom nodded seriously. His abstract expression was extremely sincere, and without any pretense. The image vividly displayed the subtext that I was a useless person, even if Weisher didn't believe a word of it. In short, your deeds have been successfully spread throughout the abyss after days of struggle. From the fallen kingdom to the blessed land, your evil name was known by everyone. No one did not know of it. However, even though it had intimidated many small fries, it was bound to provoke a backlash. Even if the rulers are busy focusing on the War of the Worlds and have no time to care about ants like us, they will definitely make arrangements. Odom looked deeper into the abyss. For example, just now, under the orders of the banquet master, the corrupt order sent out the champion of sorrows. That was the leader of a horde blessed by Bushuan, the champion of the Knights of Torment. Even if it was just him alone, it was enough to decide the outcome of a war in hell. I hope you don't confuse him with those small fries. Similarly, a blessed person from the blessed land led a whole group of hunting angels. It can be confirmed that they have their eyes on you. That was a fork that the rancher was quite fond of. Also, it seems that 2 of the twin giants from the Sea of Thunder have also regarded you as the next target of their skull hunting mission. At the same time, Golden Dawn also seem to have some movements, but their main focus should be on the construction of the stairway to hell. They won't get too involved. In the short term, Out of fear of Russell, they may choose to be cautious and watch from the sidelines. But, if there's a chance, they won't mind getting some interest back from you. Sounds like the situation is really bad. Why sure sighed? Can it be worse? Of course it can. Odom said everything he knew. The closest now should be the Solidifier organization that almost died out under the pursuit of celestial genealogy, the Children of Doomsday. They hired a whole Black Death army and are about to reach a certain depth. Apart from that, another workshop owner had already brought his factory up to the surface rapidly. And as you expected, your jester friend hasn't given up and is still running between the abyss, trying to connect more people to completely destroy your existence. At this point, Odom asked curiously, "What did you do to him? Why is he so, persistent?" "It's nothing, right? I just followed people to tear down his home, destroyed the plan that his family had prepared for hundreds of years, destroyed the only result, and seemed to have killed his only friend." Weisher thought for a moment and replied with some uncertainty, "Other than that, there shouldn't be anything else, right?" "I don't think there's a need for anything else." The snail was silent for a long time and sighed with admiration. "I always thought that you inherited the fine tradition of celestial genealogy, but I didn't expect the new generation to surpass the old. You're so young, but you've already surpassed the old. It's really amazing. Is this a compliment?" Weisher wondered. "Of course." Odom said, sincerely, "According to the words of the present world, it's really terrifying. You might even have the qualifications to be a president." Weisher was speechless and really didn't know what to say. The reality was tragic enough. He really wasn't in the mood to joke. Just like that, time passed. After a few hours, Weisher felt that the sun's ship suddenly stopped. It stopped moving. What's wrong? Weisher looked at the screen and frowned. Is there an enemy? But in the detection of the screen, there was nothing in the outside world. There was only a misty white fog, like a veil enveloping everything. There was dead silence. Everything seemed to be sleeping in a tomb. It's not an enemy. Anton looked up and stared at the faint outline in the mist. There was no change in expression on his old face, but his palm pressed on the table was so hard, as if he wanted to grab and hold something tightly. After a long time, he finally relaxed. He said, "We're here." The transit station and the development base of hell that had been abandoned for decades. Depth 51, Samara 3rd Communications Center. In the beginning, this place was once a sentry post established by the genealogy of the Russian Federation. The knights who participated in the Holy Eastern Expedition killed all the way here and temporarily reorganized. They left behind a solid fortress, built a simple church in hell, and buried their companions who died in battle. After saying goodbye to the dead, the knights who did not return went deeper into hell and were never heard from again. But its location was recorded through the resonance of the church and remained in the depth map of the Russian Federation. Later, after the Republic began the development project of hell, the Russian Federation provided everything it could, including its location. The successors re-established their foundation here, built walls and camps, and named it after the city of the Russian Federation. Then, after more than 40 years of development, step by step, this place became one of the important transit stations and hubs. There were dozens of different paths to hell connected through the resonance between the lighthouses, forming a fixed orbit and flight schedule. It was precisely because of its existence that the Ascendants were able to explore the withered area and even advance to the dark abyss. At its most glorious time, there were hundreds of Ascendants, 6 laboratories, dozens of scholars, and alchemists from all over the world. When Weisher and the others arrived, it had already been silent in this thin fog for decades, and no visitors had come. Originally, according to Weisher's best fantasy, there might still be people here who would continue to defend it. After all, there was food, weapons, and reserves here, enough for them to last for 100 years. When outsiders approached, they would issue a warning telling these guys that this was the Republic's territory, and they'd better go back to where they came from, or they would fire. And after he revealed his identity, the old people might be so excited that they would cry, curse, take out their treasured wine, have a hangover, and question why they only came here now. In this way, Huaishur could tell them that the present was different from the past. Now, everything would usher in a new turn. Unfortunately, even when they arrived, there was still no sound. It was a scene of devastation. Under the light source emitted by the sun ship, the thin fog tore apart, revealing the dilapidated walls of the past, as well as the ruins covered in moss and dust. It was as if a storm had wreaked havoc. The traces of war were still left here. There were still traces of destruction on the walls that hadn't collapsed. The overheated and warped machine guns and the unused bullets were abandoned on the pedestal of the courtyard. The completely destroyed defense system had long been buried in dust. There were even more tearing claw marks. Huge claw marks covered most of the place. Ferocious beasts galloped past here and completely destroyed the precarious defense line. The shouts and roars of the past seemed to be engraved in the air, as if one could hear them again if they closed their eyes. But nothing was left behind. They were all gone. It's all gone. Anton stood in front of the ruins and sighed. He took off his helmet, revealing his white hair. Huaishur subconsciously reached out to stop him, but the old man waved his hand indifferently. It's okay. I've just checked. The laws here are still operating normally. Besides, the air index is normal. There won't be a problem. Be careful, Huaishur reminded him and stood beside him, shrouding the shadow of the ultimate under his feet. It's okay. Anton was silent for a moment before saying softly, I just want to see it again. The old man pushed open the broken door. He walked inside. Chapter 1056. There were no hidden enemies or predators. Just like the surrounding area, this place was so desolate that it seemed that even hell's creatures could not survive here. Other than them, there were no other living creatures. Behind the door, the hall with the collapsed ceiling was silent. The schedule hanging on the wall had already turned yellow and was in pieces. The table was also in pieces. No one picked up the ballpoint pen that had rolled on the ground and hid it in the crevices of the stone. How nostalgic! Anton stopped in front of the wall and stared at the wooden frame that had no traces of its original state. He knocked on the middle and turned to Huaishur. In the past, my name was hanging here. Huaishur was slightly stunned. He followed behind him and went inside. They passed through the dilapidated corridor, the empty laboratory, and the messy rooms that had long been covered in dust. The walls and ceiling were full of cracks. There were no mottled bloodstains or tragic scenes. 70 years was enough for everything to disappear in time. Even the ruins had become gentle. It was as quiet as a tomb. Finally, the old man stopped in the courtyard and looked at the remains of a bench. After a long time, he patted the back of the chair, bent down, and took out an iron box hidden in the crack below. After opening the box, the cigarette ash inside scattered out. Anton immediately beamed. Ha! It's still here. He sat on the bench, the old seat that used to belong to him, and looked at Sure. Do you have a cigarette? I didn't bring it. Sure patted his trouser pocket and replied awkwardly, after becoming a teacher, I always felt that it was a bad influence on the students, so I decided to quit. It's good to quit. Anton smiled in an unconcerned manner. He pulled out a small crumpled bag from the inner pocket of his protective suit. Pinching out his last cigarette, he sniffed it but did not light it up. Instead, he simply hung it by his lips. In the past, my teacher also advised me to do this, but I didn't care. Later on, when I became a teacher and a parent, I realized that when children see me doing bad things, they really feel uneasy and ashamed. He hugged the box of the past and whispered with nostalgia, back then, I followed my teacher here for an internship. Although it sounded nice, in reality, I only did some electrical work and odd jobs every day. Even if everyone was working towards a great goal, someone had to be responsible for some trivial matters. My day's work revolved around circuits and gates. Most of my work was to wrestle with screws and nails. The only entertainment was a glass of wine during the weekend dinner. So occasionally, everyone would secretly play cards behind the supervisor's back. After all, the salary isn't much, and there isn't much money to lose. All I can do is read books. Life is pretty boring. When he said this, he suddenly fell silent for a long time. He lowered his head. He stared at the ashes in the box. People are never satisfied, right? Anton said softly. They never know how happy they are. Sure didn't say anything. He remained silent. Sometimes people would only realize how precious the peaceful life of the past was after losing everything they were used to. The biggest illusion of people was to think that everything could continue and never change. But change always came so quickly. It caught people off guard. The deeper they went, the more they could feel the changes brought about by time. The former third communication center no longer existed. Everything was changed beyond recognition in the war. Some were destroyed by hell creatures, and some were destroyed by humans. The engine room, warehouse, control center, there weren't many intact things. But the silver lining was that many things inside could be dismantled and repaired before continuing to be used. Even if it was just these, it was enough to temporarily fill the huge gap in the sunship. They didn't make a wasted trip, but Sure couldn't feel happy at all, because from the beginning to the end, he could only find traces of destruction and struggle, but he couldn't find any bones. The scattered crows searched again and again, but to no avail. All the remains had disappeared. Along with the violent destruction, there were no remnants left. Maybe everyone has retreated to other places. Sure forced a smile, trying to comfort Anton. Maybe. Professor Anton calmly walked in front and said, it's also possible that it was deliberately destroyed. If they had retreated to other places, it was impossible to leave such traces of fierce struggle. Moreover, the list of all the survivors in the Great Retreat was in the database of the Ivory Tower. It was impossible for there to be no news for so many years. Regarding this, he had long since been mentally prepared. After all, celestial genealogy has such a bad reputation in hell, and there are so many deep grudges. It's not surprising that someone would do such a thing. It's just that there are no bones left. As early as when the development agreement was signed, everyone was mentally prepared for this. As he spoke, he lowered his head and counted the remaining equipment and supplies in the warehouse. His expression was as usual, and there was no change in his expression. Help me remove the back cover here." He pointed to the huge rusty equipment. "Okay." Weischer reached out and touched it slightly. After sensing the internal structure and the thickness of the shell, he cut off the bolts with a clean cut. The heavy cover that was more than a person's height fell off from the main body. Anton opened the tool bag and carefully removed a crystal plate that was covered with all kinds of chips. He blew off the dust on it, and after confirming the model number again, he put it in the storage box for precision parts. Only then did he finally let out a sigh of relief. "It seems that I didn't remember wrong. When we built this place, because the technical department was lazy, in order to clear out the previous inventory, they gave the main control center's positioning system in the design. They directly used the components of the previous generation's phased array radar. At the time, it was very troublesome to maintain. Who knows how many times everyone scolded it. In the end, we didn't expect that it would be convenient for us. Now, the origin substance tracking system for the fire control equipment can be completed." Weischer followed behind and was responsible for carrying the precious items in the boxes. Together with Anton, they searched the entire base. They were like scavengers, carefully picking out any precision instruments and equipment that had not been completely damaged. If they could carry it away, they would carry it. If they couldn't, they would take it apart and send it into the Sun ship's workshop. When they passed by the dilapidated dormitory, Anton looked at it for a long time, lost in thought. He pointed at his original room to Weischer. At that time, the first batch of people to retreat was given. Everyone gave me the spot in the maintenance department. It wasn't because I was the most important, but because I was the least important. You see, if the personnel needs to be reduced, then the plumbers and electricians have to be eliminated first. That's how I luckily survived. He laughed self-deprecatingly. When we left, everyone was so busy that they didn't even have time to say goodbye. They only urged me to make more reports after returning to the present realm and send more supplies over. Everyone thought that the retreat was temporary and that they would return one day, including me. Therefore, when we said goodbye, we didn't think that we wouldn't be able to meet again. The old man sighed softly. There are still too many things that haven't been done. What a pity, Weischer thought for a moment, and answered seriously. A friend once told me that meeting and parting are always common. As long as everyone has laughed to their heart's content when they meet, there is no need to regret after parting. Although every time I think of him, I can't help but feel sad. But I feel that if I have to say goodbye to someone one day, I will definitely be like him, giving my parting friends expectations and wishes. After Anton heard this, he was silent for a long time. Then he laughed softly. My teacher might scold people. His temper isn't that good, and he never says anything gentle. However, I'm a little stronger than him now. He should be able to calm down and have a good rest. After he finished speaking, he shook his head and said to Weischer, "Let your group take care of the rest. Just follow the markings on this blueprint. The infrastructure hasn't been destroyed too much." After dismantling it, there are still many things that can be used. On the blueprint he handed over, the dismantling parts were already indicated. They were densely packed and didn't leave anything behind. Weischer hesitated for a moment. "This is the place where they fought for the last time. Is it okay to destroy it all?" Professor Anton looked at him strangely. "If it's useful, they would have helped you chop and burn these things when they were alive. Besides, they're already dead, so there's no need to care about this. Just take it that they've already agreed." When making such a decision, the old man didn't have the slightest bit of nostalgia or reluctance. He just looked around at the place where so many people had lived and protected together, as if he wanted to imprint everything in his mind. In the past, my teacher told me that we can't choose how to come and leave this world, but we can choose what to live for. Everyone chose to join the Republic because of this reason. Therefore, sacrifice and death are always common. It's not surprising. What the dead couldn't do, the living have to continue doing. What the ancestors couldn't do, the juniors have to do. If someone stops us, then we have to be enemies with them. If the predecessors pass away, then we have to turn their deaths into daggers and stab them into the enemy's heart. It was as if they were responding to his words. A gentle wind blew from the distant mist, causing his white hair to flutter slightly. A crisp sound came from the window. It was a necklace left behind by the deceased. A rusty iron plate hung on the broken chain, and the words on it could no longer be distinguished. In the silence, Anton quietly stared at the nameplate that swayed in the wind and couldn't help but smile. He reached out, gently picked it up, and hung it around his neck together with his own. My dear friends, let us reignite the furnace and forge everything. He lowered his head and promised softly, I promise that everything that disappears in the rain will be reborn in the flames. No one responded. Only the sound of iron pieces colliding with each other could be heard. It was like the laughter of the past. Long time no see. Everyone, I'm back. Chapter 1057. 2 hours later, under the destruction of the sun ship's mechanical arm and the Iron Crows, the buildings collapsed into dust. The kobolds pushed carts back and forth between the ruins and the construction site. The snake men crushed the bricks and sent them to the assembly line. Then they extracted the alloys and origin substances that had been fused into them in the past. The massive steel structure was pulled up by the crane, rising from the ruins. After being dismantled and modified, it was sent into the workshop. There were even more instruments and equipment. Those that could be used were all taken away. Those that could not be used were all dismantled, leaving behind the necessary parts as spare parts. The rest were all sent back to the furnace to be recast. Once again, the sun ship was covered in a brand new metallic light. From beginning to end, Anton sat in front of the base, silently watching, witnessing everything. When he left, he returned to his workshop and began to work. It was as if he had already used up a lifetime of rest. Without sleep or rest, day or night, he continued to produce and modify with shocking efficiency. Whiteshirt turned a blind eye to this. Apart from occasionally confirming Anton's vital signs and the necessary sleep, he did not stop him. There was no need for those meaningless concerns and obstructions. Everyone here had gambled everything, not only for themselves and their future, but also for the inheritance and weight from the past. Thus, the work continued. The mission also continued. The sun ship rumbled forward, advancing through hell. The further they went, the stranger the entire world became. A thick fog enveloped everything. There was not a single living thing to be seen. In the seemingly eternal silence, only the fog silently danced. Sometimes it would rain, and sometimes the rain would suddenly disappear. The signs of day and night gradually became less obvious, and the direction also became more and more chaotic. More importantly, the index of depth also began to become ambiguous. It was constantly changing. Sometimes it seemed like they were in the Earth realm, but sometimes it was frighteningly high. The sun ship always activated the highest driving depth stabilizer, and it was difficult to bear the load at the highest peak. Sometimes it seemed like there was a silent city or some mountain range passing by them, but when the searchlight shone over, only an illusion could be seen. Thanks to such a strange environment, even the soldiers chasing after them had to slow down, buying them precious time. If it weren't for Odom's presence, they would have been lost in this strange area. They could have relied on their fellow clansmen sleeping in the depths of the fog to determine their direction and guide them. He didn't even know how deep he had gone, how many hells he had passed, and what kind of places he had passed. Sometimes the ground would suddenly be torn apart, and fissures and deep valleys would appear. They couldn't see the bottom of the darkness, so they could only take a detour. Under the pressure of sunship, stones would crumble from the edges of the deep valleys and fall into the darkness. Sometimes they would suddenly fall in front of them, or perhaps it would smash into the barrier. "Welcome to the Scar area, everyone." On the bridge, Odom said straightforwardly, "Looks like we're about to enter the second half of our journey. Congratulations." Unfortunately, once one entered this area, the changes in depth would become very strange. From now on, other than navigation, I'm afraid I can no longer provide you with a convenient and rapid return service. Not only here, even up and down, all the way to the deepest part of the dark area, there are unknown disturbances. Even the path to enter here is uncertain. The deeper you go, the more complicated the situation becomes. In a short period of time, you don't have to worry about the pursuers behind you. Just focus on moving forward. Is this the curl formed by the deep backflow? Huaishur stared at the gradually strange world outside the sunship. It was a strange domain, formed by countless fragments of hell pieced together. This was the phantom pain that had lasted from the beginning of the Great Retreat to the present, the Scar area. With the fall of Kingdom of Heaven and the birth of the destruction element, the Golden Dawn project that amended hell back, then had buried most of the elites of the Utopia in hell. The original Golden Dawn project was an extension of the fourth project, Kingdom of Heaven. It was a subsidiary organization that was born in order to smoothly enter the second phase after the birth of Kingdom of Heaven. Its mission was to gradually transform the deep area through several stages and turn it into an extension of the border, the back garden of the present realm. Then, a new stage of exploration was launched toward the deeper areas. First, it was the deep area, then the withered area, followed by the dark abyss. This way, step by step, with the present realm as the foundation, nibbling away at hell. Many outposts in the deep area were also established as the early warning and defense institutions of this project. At that time, the trend of pioneering among the sublimated people of the present realm was unprecedentedly strong. Not only the Utopia, but exploration teams belonging to various lineages almost covered most corners of the entire abyss. It was worth mentioning that Huaishur's ancestor, Huaiguang, had dug out his first bucket of gold during the pioneering at that time and laid the foundation for the Huai clan's shipping. And just as everyone knew, whether it was the Utopia, the Fourth Project, Kingdom of Heaven, the Golden Dawn Project, or even the inconspicuous Huai clan shipping, they all ushered in a lonely ending. What was achieved was only the Golden Dawn, which existed as the destruction element from then on. Its purpose also changed from protecting the present realm and expanding hell to destroying the entire world and making hell swallow everything. It was like the moment the rancher was born, the gods ushered in the destruction of the gods. The Utopia was also subverted by the Golden Dawn, including everything they had created in hell. It was also buried in the deep backflow. Under the scheming arrangements, Kingdom of Heaven went completely out of control the moment it went online. Not only did the present realm suffer unprecedented waves, but all the malice hidden in the darkness finally erupted from hell. Under the Golden Dawn Project, all the hubs of hell created to correct the depth were completely connected in an instant. Even hell was involved, like a directional explosion, from the edge of the present realm all the way to the bottom of the abyss. A straight crack was artificially created between countless depths. Immediately after, the gravity of the present realm triggered an unprecedented siphoning effect. In the end, What was created was a tragic blowout from the bottom of the abyss. The power from the quiet area was like oil gushing upward through the open sluice gates. The violent turbulence not only awakened many silent rulers in advance, but the blowout also sent many hells to depths that did not belong to them. Even the fragments of hell in the quiet area and the monsters sleeping there were thrown in the direction of the present realm. Countless tributaries gathered in one place and gradually formed a terrifying impact that was enough to shake the three major blockades. In the end, before the big wave was completely formed, all the people who received the notice had to make a choice. Should they seize the last moment to retreat, or should they gamble everything with a success rate of less than 5% and sacrifice everything to turn back and close the sluice gate that was about to bring destruction? They only had less than an hour to consider all of this, but in the end, the time they spent was less than half a minute. Orton, Ingfangzo, Gerard, Chachel, Murian, Arthur, Yuri, Li Jing, countless heroes made their own choices and stepped on the path to death without hesitation. More than 20 lines of defense, dozens of positions in different depths, as well as ascendants, scholars, and alchemists from all over the world. On that day, in the endless depths, in the countless hells, the shining brilliance of the stars illuminated the darkness of the blowout and blocked the front of the crack. In the end, they exchanged for a miracle that was enough to overturn the disaster. The door of destruction was closed again. The remaining impact was blocked outside the realm by the three major blockades. The aftermath formed a deep scar between the countless hells, and it had not healed even after decades. And as a price, only a few people survived that short rescue. The elites and a large number of grassroots members of the Utopia were completely buried. There was no room for redemption. What Huaishur and the others saw now was only a ripple left in hell. The true torrent had long been annihilated in the past, along with the dead. At this moment, Huaishur stared at the white fog outside the sunship and the grave-like silent world. Perhaps it was no different from a cemetery. The past glory, achievements, and even that glorious era were all buried in this eternally silent world. Even though he was already prepared, when he really witnessed all of this, he didn't know whether to be proud or sad. "It's so quiet," he murmured softly. After a long time, he closed his eyes and gradually fell asleep during the long journey. The sudden dream seemed to pass by in a flash. He slowly woke up, but in a daze, he heard a song coming from not far away. The soft and deep humming echoed in the vast and lofty world. When Huaishur opened his eyes, he found that everything in front of him was completely different. He could no longer see the furnishings on the sunship. There was only a barren land that extended to the end of his line of sight. The empty world seemed to have been abandoned long ago. Above the gloomy sky, the dim light sprinkled down, illuminating all the vague silhouettes. The entire world had lost its color. Only a red skirt fluttered in the wind, elegantly fluttering in the air like a flame burning. And a familiar side profile, close at hand, she stood in front of him, looking at everything. There are only illusions of the sun and stars in the sky, and the earth in the darkness is lifeless. The figure had her hands behind her back as she stared at the world with her contractor. "Look, Huaishur," she said, "this is hell." "Tangi?" Huaishur sat on a chair and looked around blankly. It was difficult to determine what kind of bizarre change this was, or if it was his own imagination and illusion. "Long time no see." Tangi lowered her head and winked at Huaishur, smiling slightly. "Did you miss me?" "You." Huaishur was stunned. "Why are you here?" "Of course it's because you missed me." Tangi smiled gently. A strand of hair fluttered slightly and brushed across his face with a familiar aura. "So I came," she said, I came to your dream. Chapter 1058. In a dream, Huaishir suddenly understood and responded, You dragged me into this dream? No, it's the opposite. Tangyi half forcefully pushed him aside and squeezed into the chair. She put her arm around his shoulder and sighed. It's your dream that's calling me, Huaishir. That's why I'm here. She turned around and looked at Huaishir with a faint smile. Is it so hard to admit that you miss me, Huaishir? I didn't, don't talk nonsense. Huaishir subconsciously shook his head and refuted. Just as he was about to say something, he heard a sigh beside him. Speaking of which, you seem to have become a little gloomy recently. Tangyi sighed softly. Even your dreams are so tragic. Did something happen? In the past, at least, I would occasionally go to the beach with the girls. Oh, the hot summer, the laughter, the waves and cold drinks, the sound of the tide, and volleyball. Now that I think about it, I really miss it. Huaishir's body subconsciously tensed up. He didn't know if it was because Tangyi was too close to him or because of her words. He was frightened and nervous. Don't be shy. I don't know anything. She dragged her strange tone, and her smile became more and more cheerful. Although there are a lot of people, the content is quite complete. At most, it's at the level of 16 plus. Isn't it a little too innocent? Ha ha ha, so cute. Doesn't that mean you know everything? Huaishir trembled with anger, and tears almost flowed down his face. I'm just trying to give you some privacy. Tangyi blinked innocently with a sincere face, completely ignoring the huge trauma that her contractor's heart had suffered. I haven't told you about the dreams in the library during recess, in the office's lounge, and the candlelight dinner. It's my fault. Please don't say any more. Let me go. Huaishir put his palms together and didn't dare to act rashly. Did you come all the way here just to urge me to hang myself? No, it's just that I haven't been out for a long time and felt that you seemed to need someone to accompany you, so I came over to take a look. Tangyi took a sip from a cup of milk tea that came out of nowhere. Just in time. I'll let you rest for a while. Huaishir's hand suddenly sank. A cup of milk tea appeared out of thin air. Double pearls, 3 parts sugar. It was perfect for his taste, and it was steaming hot as if it was real. After he took a bite out of curiosity, he tasted a mellow and delicious flavor that he had never imagined. Dreams can even simulate this. Oh, just take it as a gift from a kind-hearted person who saw that you were sad. Remember to say thank you. Tangyi sighed with emotion and looked into the distance. It was as if she could see another dream, where an unlucky person who had waited in line for several hours for milk tea was met with an unexpected disaster. Her fingers moved slightly, and the cure who wanted to cry but had no tears felt that he was hit on the head by a heavy box. The box fell to the ground, and the banknotes inside fell out and drowned him. And in another dream, a group of robbers who were in a fierce firefight with the police didn't realize that the weight of the box in their arms had suddenly lightened a lot. Countless bubbles of dreams seemed to be close at hand, but as her fingers moved, they disappeared again in the rainbow light of the silver sea and returned to nothingness. Replenish some sugar and calories. It's good for improving your mood. Tangyi emptied the cup in her hand and threw it into the empty world. She looked at the hell in front of her and suddenly asked, because of the scar area? Yes. Huaishir sighed. Sometimes, although I already know and have been mentally prepared, I still feel sad when I see and touch it with my own eyes. That's their own choice. They have chosen the ending for themselves. Tangyi said, for idealists, there's nothing more satisfying than such an outcome. At least, it's better than living a life of inaction and dying silently in a hospital bed. Maybe. Huaishir was silent for a moment and asked softly, Tangyi, why is there such a thing as hell? I know that everything has an ending, but why? Because it's also a part of the world. Why, sure? Tangi answered matter-of-factly, it's just like the present. Disasters and miracles are one, suffering and redemption coexist. Nothing appears out of thin air, and there are no miracles without a price in this world. Don't tell me you've never found it strange. Snake people, rat people, minotaurs, why do so many creatures of hell have traces of the present? Or do you think that it's natural for most intelligent creatures in hell to look like humans? Huaishur was stunned. He couldn't answer. Whether it's humans or beasts, all life is formed because of miracles. But where do miracles come from? Tangi's smile was mysterious. There must be a reason for everything. Huaishur, even if it's the wind and tide from afar, there must be butterflies flapping their wings and whales stirring up the waves in places you can't see. You should explore the reason. Huaishur shook his head and became more and more helpless. Don't keep me in suspense. Tangi, can't you tell me the answer directly? Of course not. Tangi spread her hands helplessly. Some answers can be told to you directly, but some answers are only meaningful if you think about it yourself. Only this, why sure, you have to think about it yourself. You have to have your own answer. Huaishur didn't say anything. In silence, he drank his milk tea. After a long time, he shook his head. I suddenly feel that it's more convenient to be a tool in the past. At least, I don't have to face these problems. The reason why tools are tools is that they have no choice. The chess pieces are placed on the chessboard, the soldiers are thrown into the battlefield, and the gods come to this world. The essence is the same. There is no difference between being driven by the will of others and being driven by fate. Huaishur, you have always felt that everything is involuntary. But when you really have the power to choose, why do you start to be nostalgic for the past? Tangi looked into his eyes and asked, what are you worried about? Huaishur wanted to say something, but stopped. He didn't know how to tell her that he was afraid. He was afraid of failure. No matter how tough he appeared, no matter how cold he was, once he thought of the consequences of failure, he couldn't help but want to run away. If one day he failed to live up to the heavy responsibility entrusted to him and failed miserably, how could he face those companions who entrusted their lives to him and those who sacrificed themselves in hell for their future? Do you know what I'm worried about? Huaishur? Tangi suddenly asked. When Huaishur looked up in confusion, he saw Tangi's serious expression. Huaishur, if you love something more than yourself, then one day you will sacrifice everything for what you love. This is a matter of course. She said, but when these people sacrifice themselves, they rarely think that there are still people in this world who love them more than their own lives. In my opinion, the failure of the utopia was due to this overly arrogant selflessness. There are always people who think that they can save everything and solve all the problems, but it's impossible. It's not shameful to admit the limits of one's existence. Even the powerful gods in the past can't do it. I can't teach you how to avoid failure, but I have to remind you. That is, don't become such an irresponsible scumbag. Understand? As she spoke, her face inched closer to Huaishur's, and her gentle breath caressed Huaishur's face. Huaishur's eyes reflected her own image, so solemn and serious, so close. Huaishur froze in place, unable to move. He nodded with difficulty. I will try my best. So, Tangi nodded in satisfaction, reached out, held his collar, and patted him on the shoulder. Very good. Keep this attitude, and remember what I said. I promise, Huaishur, you will have a happy life and ending. She paused for a moment, and her smile became more and more cheerful. Finally, for the sake of your good attitude in admitting your mistake, I'll give you another reminder. In the silence, Tangi asked, Did you overlook something? Why sure are the problems you want to solve only these that you know? The so-called jester, the so-called enemy, the so-called Hell Legion. Are you afraid of such an enemy? Tangi bent down and whispered in his ear. Or is there something important that you have forgotten? She paused for a moment, and her smile became more and more mischievous. And is there really nothing left of the blowout caused by the deep backflow, accompanied by those soft words? The world in the dream shook violently. Something hidden in the deepest part of his thoughts was awakened by Tangi's words. The uneasiness and anxiety that had always been triggered by instinct and subconsciousness condensed into a tangible outline, rising from the deepest part of the dream, something that he had subconsciously forgotten and ignored. The sky trembled, and the earth cracked. The barren world was annihilated into nothingness. With Tangi's departure, the dream was shattered. But at the bottom of the dream, in the deeper dream, there was a bone-chilling evil emerging. In the endless abyss fragments, pure darkness surged, and a terrifying shadow rose from the deepest part of hell. The storm between the depths was just a ripple set off when it moved. The huge hell was just a bubble in front of it. Cries full of resentment and hunger spread. With just a glimpse of that colossus, it had already been branded in Huaishi's soul and could no longer be forgotten. Even if it was just an outline in his memories, it was enough to make the entire dream fall apart. At this moment, under Tangi's guidance, it once again appeared at the end of the dream that was on the verge of shattering. Once again, it cast a cold glance at him. That monster, on Sun's ship, Huaishi suddenly opened his eyes and gasped for breath. In a short moment, he was already drenched in sweat. He didn't dare to believe his own guess. That shadow that had appeared from the deepest part of the abyss when they had escaped from the white lightning plains, the colossus that had set off the storm, was actually still chasing after them. No, at the end of the day, was that encounter really a coincidence? Was such an exaggerated and terrifying thing attracted by that group of hunters hiding in the depths? Or was it that it had been awakened by the existence of Sun's ship? An indescribable intuition told him that this was not a delusion. After experiencing a loss, the darkness did not return. Instead, it smelled the familiar scent that remained in the depths. It was full of resentment and thirst as it chased after them. Instead, it had conscientiously guided them on the route, doing a brilliant job as a guide. Not only did he answer all the questions, but he was also able to speak clearly and logically when it came to the products and specialties of certain parts of hell. If she walked in front with a flag on her head and waved it twice, it would almost make people suspect that she was a gold medal tour guide from some scenic spot. It could even be turned into food at critical times. It was simply impeccable. When he thought of this, Huaishi looked at it with an especially appreciative gaze. Odom trembled all over. He subconsciously felt a little uneasy. He moved back a little. Unfortunately, the snail's speed was too slow, and it looked no different from standing in place. Fortunately, Huaishi did not say something like, "If you don't want to become food, take a step back." Instead, he curiously stuck his head out and looked at it carefully. For some reason, there are some things that are inconvenient for me to show my face. So, he paused for a moment and said meaningfully, "Can I ask you for a small favor?" 10 minutes later, a brand new altar had been erected on the deck of the Sun ship, which had come to a sudden stop. However, this did not look like a ritual to pray for power from a certain hell powerhouse. It was not serious and cold, and there was no blood sacrifice or sacrifice. At best, it was just a communication device. Then, Huaishi threw 2 origin crystals and a handful of calamity coins on it. "Okay, it's about time to start." He turned back and said to Odom, "As for how to disguise yourself as an ordinary hell creature, I don't need to teach you more, right? I understand. I understand. Odom waved his tentacles excitedly. As long as you don't let me eat tigers, I'm good at pretending to be a pig. Very good. Huaishur nodded to express his encouragement, then picked up the rust snail and placed it on the altar's sacrificial spot. Odom was not nervous at all. Instead, his two big eyes were filled with anticipation as he began to wait. Then, Huaishur thought for a moment and rubbed 3 welding rods to act as incense sticks. The entire altar, at least, looked a little more proper. Then he shook his body and quickly bent his body. His face protruded, and he turned into a dog-headed person that was commonly seen everywhere in hell like a pest. He devoutly prostrated himself in front of the altar. He opened his arms. He called out affectionately, "Great Paradise, Lord of the world's joy and beautiful dreams, your humble believer calls here, praying for your majestic appearance to descend, praying for your profound wisdom to guide me, praying for your infinite power to show me." He was starting to summon people. Following his impassioned chanting, the alchemy array lit up layer by layer. Through the connection of the sunship, the high-power antenna was outputted, penetrating the fog at the edge of the scar area. Then, the broadcast of the source form spread out in the noisy hell. Following the operation of the antenna, Huaishur carefully adjusted the knob in her hand, locking on to the resonance of paradise on her body. She repeatedly searched through the layers and finally landed on a remote place in the withered area where there was no one. And a suspicious gaze followed the call of the secret device and looked at this place from afar. Suspiciously, it looked around. Behind the shielding device, everyone was on high alert. They held their breaths and let the gaze sweep past them like air. There were no signs of abnormalities, until the gaze hidden behind the scenes confirmed that there was no danger. Then, a deep shadow slowly appeared on the altar. The voice was cold and majestic, like a king from the dark abyss, with a disdainful aura. He asked calmly, "Who is it calling for majesty?" F*CK. The moment the shadow appeared, Huaishur stepped on the altar and stepped forward. He directly grabbed the head of the shadow and pulled with all his might. Following his action, the whale-catching harpoon that was ready to be shot on the sunship roared and shot out. The source form that had undergone a qualitative change of divinity wrapped around the shadow. In an instant, after penetrating dozens of layers, it forcefully wrapped around the shadow's body and dragged it here. Descend. After a loud roar, the altar collapsed. Kitten, who was smoking with his legs crossed, smashed into the secret device together with the chair under his butt. Layers of binding, entangling, and suppressing him. Then countless guns and cannons were aimed at his face. On the tattered ragdoll clothes, the originally satisfied smile froze on the spot. "Big brother, spare me, wait." Before he could react, Kitten subconsciously raised his hands and screamed, "I don't know why, sure, you've got it wrong. I'm just Lou. Wait." He paused for a moment, sensing that something was amiss. His gaze swept across the crowd and finally landed on the kobold. He was suspicious. "Who are you?" In the silence, the kobold slowly removed his disguise and said expressionlessly, "The one you just said you don't know." Dead silence. Half of Kitten's cigarette ash fell on his chin and burned a new black spot. "Ah, this," he coughed awkwardly, looked around, and put on an indignant and accusatory expression. "Huaishur, you're not being nice. Hurry up and let go of me. We've been friends for so many years, and you're still letting me fish. I can't help it." Huaishur moved a chair over and sat in front of him. He didn't look like he was going to let go of Kitten at all. He just asked curiously, "If I don't use some tricks, will you be willing to see me?" "Of course," Kitten answered without hesitation. "Absolutely not." What a joke. How could others not know? How could he not know how strange Huaishur was? Wherever he went, there would be explosions. Whoever he touched would die. Whoever met him would be unlucky. If he touched them, they would die. If he hit them, they would die. Did he really think that the name Disaster Sword was just for show? Back then, not long after he ate one fish for 5 meals, he began to regret it. Why did he have to get involved with this freeloader for the sake of negotiating money? He didn't get many benefits. Instead, he was treated as a freeloader. Even if he applied for an annual card, he couldn't come every day. Back then, he moved quickly and had Yamatai to block the disaster for him. But now, where could he find an unlucky guy to be a scapegoat? Moreover, ever since the name of celestial genealogy became more and more famous in hell, all the partners began to look at him strangely. I heard that Sure from the present realm, the one who especially likes to behead people, is from your family? He really wanted to refute with righteous words, but wasn't the crown of the Paradise Prince on Sure's head given out by the Paradise Prince back then? If he could have known earlier that Sure was so good at creating things, he would have stopped this matter even if he had to quarrel with the Paradise Prince again. But now, he couldn't even avoid it. The hatred of both sides had been bound. Now, the entire border between the Withered Zone and the Deep Zone was in a mess because of a member of celestial genealogy. So many large groups of people were tortured to death. Rounding up, almost all the famous forces in the abyss were messing with him. In order to avoid the limelight, he could only move again with tears in his eyes. He even endured the pain of closing the 2 branches that had just opened. It was the time when he couldn't make ends meet and had to tighten his belt to live. Otherwise, how could he have fallen to the point where he had to personally come out to extort Cough, the moneymaker? Thinking of this, his eyes turned red. Unfortunately, the smoke stains were too thick and couldn't be seen at all. Kitten said earnestly, Sure, at least we had a short-lived marriage. Back then, we were inseparable. Both of us were willing. You can't push me into the fire pit. Look at what you're saying. Aren't we a family? Sure crossed his legs and said calmly, how can we eat together when there's nothing to do and go our separate ways when there's something to do? Of course, if we die together. Hey, don't go too far. Kitten was so angry that she wanted to hit the table, but she was tied up by the chain and couldn't move. She could only twist her body to express her anger. The road to the Paradise Prince has already been handed over to the new inheritor. Our agreement with celestial genealogy has already been fulfilled. For so many years, we worked so hard to be your custodian and OEM. We paid for the materials ourselves and were responsible for the after-sales. We didn't even ask for a single cent. We just wanted to ride on your popularity. What's wrong with that? You can't just catch a toad and kill it, right? Oh, then this is the second deal. Sure touched the cigarette ash and said seriously, I, representing celestial genealogy, re-establish an alliance with the Paradise Prince. Kitten shouted angrily, the Paradise Prince is not available. Sure smiled. Don't you want to hear my conditions? Kitten shook her head decisively. I don't. Before he finished speaking, a dark silhouette appeared behind him. It was as if a huge city had appeared in layers of fog. A dim rainbow hung from the top of the castle, bringing with it strands of light. It flashed and disappeared. Only the magnificent sound of the bell echoed in the fog and gradually dissipated, bypassing its chosen agent. The will of the Paradise Prince came here and launched a response. Kitten was furious. Stop it. That's enough. He turned his head, wriggled in the shackles, and scolded angrily. Don't you think about it? It's been so many years. Who has cared about us? If I hadn't been so shameless and spent so much money, I wouldn't have been able to live. Now that we've finally been free for a few days, why are you still rushing forward to join in the fun? Isn't it good to have a long memory? Dong. The mighty sound of the bell rang once again in response. Kitten's face twitched. She didn't know if it was from embarrassment or helplessness. She stomped her feet and said, "Fine, fine, fine. You guys are all right. I'm the only one who's stingy, okay?" Dong. The bell rang again. This time, a gentle force brushed past and unlocked Kitten's shackles. It even stuffed a new cigarette into the corner of her mouth, lit it, and patted her on the shoulder. It was as if she was gently comforting her. Kitten smoked silently. After a long time, she snorted twice, put out the cigarette, and looked at Huai Shi. "Tell me, what are your conditions?" He said coldly, "Let's be frank. Take out something real. Don't make empty promises and trick us unlucky people into working for you for free, okay? I've had enough of the Republic." Huai Shi thought for a moment and solemnly promised, "Then how about letting the theme parks open everywhere?" Kitten immediately snorted and sneered. She glanced at Huai Shi. If cultivation bases are so easy to earn, why are those rulers fighting the War of the Worlds? Don't you care about your face? Do you think we'll open it just because you say so? Yes. Huai Shi nodded and told her, "We'll open it just because I say so." Kitten's expression instantly stiffened. Huai Shi's words were still going on. Ingzhou, Dongxia, America, the Russian Federation, Rome. Kitten, other than Egypt, you can open it anywhere you want. Danbua has already prepared the land. If you hadn't been afraid of trouble during this period of time and avoided me like the plague, the theme park would have started operating long ago. I won't make empty promises to you, nor will I make any promises to you that can't be fulfilled. But now, if you're willing to go to the lobby, I can give you the entire Las Vegas. At that time, it doesn't matter how many carousels and roller coasters you want to build. Even if you cover the entire city in the theme park, I can help you do it. 3 years. He raised his finger and promised, "In 3 years at most, the correction value you earn will be enough for the theme park to temporarily get rid of the influence of solidification and return to your original appearance." Without waiting for Kitten to answer, Huai Shi leaned closer and asked in a low voice, "Think about it, Kitten. How many years have you not been in the sun? How many years have you not appeared in your original appearance? This opportunity is right in front of you." He said, "As long as you say the word." In the brief silence, the kitten's hands trembled slightly. There was a moment when she seemed to be tempted, but then she forced herself to put on an indifferent look and snorted, "Just this little thing, and you want to dong." The low and deep sound of the bell rang again. He interrupted him. "Hey, I'm talking business here. Can you stay out of it?" Kitten turned around and shouted angrily, "Brothers, we should settle accounts clearly." "You." Her voice came to an abrupt stop. At that moment, her movements froze on the spot, and she began to twitch violently. A huge will gradually squeezed into her body and took over everything by force. Like a dying old man on a hospital bed, Kitten opened her mouth and let out a slow and hoarse voice, telling him, "These are not important." In the short silence, Huai Shi was stunned. He felt the source substance surging in Kitten's body at this moment. It was so weak, so painful. It was like struggling with difficulty in a quagmire, holding tightly onto a straw, but it no longer had the strength to get up. "I can promise more," Huai Shi replied, "but I need time to complete it. Those things are not important." Kitten, "No." The will of the paradise raised its head with difficulty. As if it was talking in a dream, it told him, "Laughter, children, and hugs and flowers." When it made a sound, its eyes seemed to light up with the light of the past. In the midsummer of the past, the bright sunshine seemed to be eternal. Colorful balloons floated in the blue sky, just like the bubbles of a fairy tale. roller coasters, balls, floats, and merry-go-rounds. The children ran excitedly in the square, dancing and holding the hands of the smiling dolls. Laughter could be heard. Everything was as beautiful as a never-ending dream. But those distant dreams had long since passed away. Along with the joy, the paradise was no longer there. Thus, in the empty eyes, turbid tears slowly flowed down. See. It murmured hoarsely, as if it was begging, looking at why sure. Everyone once again laughed together. It was like the angry roar of a giant beast. In the river, the blurry shadow spasmed again. Its formless body stirred up the current, causing the alarm to sound even more piercing. That was the so-called snake. No, it wouldn't be too much to call it a dragon sin, right? For a farming nation like the Eastern Xia, since ancient times, the rivers and rivers were the embodiment of hope and life. It was precisely because there was an endless supply of water that more land could be irrigated, more plants could be cultivated, and more people could be raised. It was because of this that a totem like the dragon existed. If the countless towering mountains were the bones of the dragon's veins, then the complex water system that covered the entire Eastern Xia was the body of the dragon. The endless rivers were like blood covering the entire country. Wherever it passed, all living things grew. This was the dragon. It was this generous gift from the dragon that allowed countless lives to flourish and flourish. The so-called dragon's veins were like this. Mountains, rivers, earth, and people were indispensable. If the dragon was the one that nourished all living things and gave life, then this uncontrollable power and overflowing torrent was no different from a snake. The battle between dragons and snakes had never stopped since ancient times. It could be foreseen that it would continue into the future. Now, the climate disaster that the flute player had brought to the world had already appeared. It was not only a drought and a storm. What it had brought out was this disaster that had been silent for many years. When the material disaster combined with this silent disaster, it would bring the slumbering serpent back to life from nothingness and evolve into countless evil creatures. It was not just at this moment. Here, a war that spread throughout the entire Eastern Xia had begun a month ago. There was no smoke in the battle between humans and natural disasters. There was only thunder and the roars of countless people under the storm, as well as the battle between the disaster serpents that longed to become dragons and the Eastern Xia lineage in the shadows. Under the shelter, Mo-san, who was wearing a raincoat, hurried back. The fierce battle with the water monsters had consumed too much of his energy. The fire attribute Stigmata was especially disgusted with this kind of weather. Even his face looked a bit pale. After coming in, he sat down on a cushion, unable to get up. Yuan Zhao, give me a cup of water. Yuan Zhao. HM? Where's that kid Yuan Zhao? She looked around and frowned. Isn't he supposed to be your guard? Did he skip work again? Chu Hongchen held back his laughter and pointed below the dam. There, isn't that him? Mo-san narrowed his eyes. In the mud, among the figures moving back and forth, he searched for a long time before finding the young man covered in mud. He was carrying a sandbag the size of a small mountain on his shoulder as he hurriedly ran behind the formation. His originally handsome face was covered in mud, and his hair was a mess. It was impossible to tell that it was him. Mo-san's expression looked a bit better, but he was still a bit unhappy. Is this kid going crazy again? I arranged it, Chu Hongchen replied. I'm a piece of trash that can't carry anything. I can only sit in the camp and slack. Why would I need a guard? I might as well go down and be useful. But that kid is much more reliable than before. He's been running around like an animal for 2 days, and he hasn't complained. He's grown up. Mo-san's expression became slightly gratified. Children will grow up. Isn't this much better than his sloppy appearance? That's right. Chu Hongchen nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with sympathy. Unfortunately, in the world of adults, it's not only age that will increase, the amount of work will also increase. He actually has time to pee. Later, get someone to give him more work. Mo Sen didn't say anything. Everyone in the Social Security Bureau already acknowledged that although Big Cousin was considerate when he wasn't a person, he didn't seem like a person at all. Unfortunately, when he wasn't a person, there were more times than when he was considerate. It caused the girls to privately discuss whether this was a new type of PUA method. "How's the situation upstream?" Chu Hongchen asked. "It's still very tense." Emosen took a breath and replied, "The rainfall is still rising. The water level is about to reach its highest point in history. Keep an eye on it. Have everyone stay alert. Floods, droughts, plagues, everything is tense. We can't lose face at this juncture." Chu Hongchen emphasized again. "If something goes wrong, the losses will be incalculable." Emosen nodded solemnly. He thought for a moment and comforted, "The entire realm is tense. No matter what, we're better than those people who maintain the system." "Can't you learn a bit?" Chu Hongchen rolled his eyes and didn't mention this topic. He only asked, "What did Rainmaster and Windcount say?" "They're trying to disperse the clouds, but it's not very effective. The rainfall upstream is really too high," Mo Sen said softly. "When I came here, I heard people say that it's better to just take out Hanba's authoritative relic." When Chu Hongchen heard this, he stopped eating and raised his head. His expression became even more solemn. "You think so too? I'm not in charge of using my brain. What's the point of thinking about this?" "Some people just think too much," Chu Hongchen sneered. "In order to solve a temporary emergency, to indirectly increase the degree of distortion. What's the difference between that and drinking poison to quench thirst? Authoritative relics weren't just terrifying in power." He looked at the rolling turbid current in front of him and the phantom of a huge snake that stretched for thousands of miles. He was expressionless. "Let's see who can endure who." No one responded. There was only the raging river under the towering dam. In the distance, at the edge of another dam, beside the rolling turbid current, water splashed. A piece of old waterproof cloth was propped up. The firewood burned vigorously in the high stove, causing the fragrance under the pot lid to grow stronger. The rain is beating on the pear blossoms, and the mud has fallen to the ground. Send the little red lady to Jian Shixiang, and the Eastern Pavilion will hold a banquet to get over the shock. Beside the boiling soup pot, an old man sat on a chair and looked at the river. He smoked and hummed an old melody leisurely. After the lid was lifted, the sweet fragrance of the eel soup spread out. Not only did it make the passers-by within a radius of several hundred meters swallow their saliva, even the rolling torrent seemed to be surging with shadows that were moving closer and closer. It was difficult to hide the thirst. The old man scooped a spoonful for himself unhurriedly. He took a sip and frowned slightly. "It's still a little bland." "Forget it, I'll make do. Little monkeys, stop looking. Come and eat." He knocked on the side of the pot and waved at the young people who were quietly poking their heads out from under the canopy not far away. The young people hesitated for a moment and looked at the class monitor behind them. The class monitor squatted by the side and smoked. He glared at them angrily. "Why are you looking at me? Look at the discipline. Do you still have any discipline?" "There are also pancakes," the old man added. "Hot." The class monitor's expression twitched, and his stomach began to growl. He had not eaten yet. "I'm a handyman in the cooking class." The old man finally said with a smile, "Not part of the crowd." "Give me a bowl." In the silence, the class monitor's hands trembled as he took out his lunchbox. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back. There was no other way. The soup was too fragrant. Soon, the pot of thick soup and 2 baskets of pancakes disappeared into the hungry young people's mouths. Before the horn was blown, the class monitor returned the stack of money and the baskets. "Thank you, sir. You should leave as soon as you're done. It's too dangerous here. I heard the water level will rise again in a while." "Okay, you guys go." "I know." The old man nodded and smiled. "This pot of soup is not ready yet. I need to simmer it for a while." The class monitor wanted to say something, but there was no time. He left behind a handcart and hurried away. Not far away, Yuan Zhao, who was sniffing the remaining fragrance, peeked his head out. When he saw the stooped figure, he slipped and almost fell into the mud. He subconsciously shrunk his head and wanted to slip away. Being stared at by that pair of eyes, he couldn't say anything. After a long time, he staggered back and sat on the ground, sobbing tiredly. "I still have a daughter. She's only 4 years old. For years old, Valia. If I can't go back, what will happen to her?" The sound of snow being shoveled and ice being knocked did not stop. Everyone was silent, suppressing the urge to roar. Their faces were red with anger as the cold wind blew. It was as if they wanted to tear the world apart. But in his sorrowful cries, there was a warm smell of incense. "Poor child, he's just scared." The skinny priest in black stood in front of him, lowering his head and looking at him. In the priest's hand, the incense ball burned silently, spreading warmth in the cold world. "Don't be afraid." The priest's face twitched, as if he was trying hard to squeeze out a kind expression. But in contrast with his excessively thin face, it looked even weirder. "You will go back." He dipped his finger in some holy oil and gently smeared it on Ivan's forehead, assuring him, "I just came back from there. Ivan, there's no avalanche. You just misheard." Misheard? Ivan was dumbfounded. "Yes, the engineering team in front is blowing up some collapsed rocks," the priest said in a hoarse voice. "You will see your child, Ivan. Your child will lie in front of the window next to the fireplace, waiting for you to come back. When the time comes, you have to tell her everything you did, like a hero." He thought for a moment and said with certainty, "Everyone will go back. I promise you." Ivan was stunned for a long time. He couldn't help but shed tears in front of that face that couldn't be called benevolent. "Please continue with your work, everyone." The priest, who had appeared out of nowhere, bowed his head and said, "The Holy Spirit will definitely protect you." Just like that, holding the incense ball in his hand, the skinny priest chanted scriptures in a low voice, calmly blessing everyone. Once again, he walked into the snowstorm. In the distance, and even further, the sacred flag was faintly visible in the snow, and the chants spread. Even more priests were trekking across the wasteland, as if they were on a pilgrimage. They formed long queues that were separated from each other. Above the mountains, the rolling bleak white froze in the air, and the rumbling stopped. Those lonely figures were like nails wedged into the ground, fixing the collapsing avalanche in place, unable to move an inch forward. After a long time, everything returned to silence. The priest turned back and took a last look at the specks of light that were struggling to move forward after the snow filled the sky. He bowed his head and gave his last blessing. In front of him, the priest who was waiting reminded him, "Isai, let's go." "Yes." Isai turned back. "I'm coming." Just like that, they turned and moved forward again, disappearing at the end of the snowstorm. The storm continued. The mission also continued. Above the dry Nile River in Egypt, the smell of mud and decay floated. Outside the oasis, thousands of miles of sand danced. The brutal sunlight shrouded the sky and sprinkled down, torturing everything in the thirst. Countless stray water vapor was swept away by the dry wind, flying into the distance. It had been 2 weeks in a row, but there was no rain. Outside the city, amidst the sandstorm, countless pyramids were silent in the shadows. In the deepest darkness, amidst the erosion of endless disasters, the pharaoh slowly opened his mouth and let out a soft sound. It was like a long sigh. It was also like a soft moan that came from the gap between countless nightmares. The hand holding the scepter was as thin as firewood, but it never let go. It was as if he was holding the reins of the country. He used so much strength. Blood that was as thick as asphalt flowed down from his hand, along the scepter, and flowed into the trajectory of the secret instrument. Thus, the layer of rainbow light that enveloped the entire territory appeared again. Like a thin fetal membrane protecting a baby, it enveloped the entire territory and border, sending down strands of sweet rain. Once again, the sandstorm within thousands of miles was smoothed out. And thousands of miles away, in India, countless pitch-black tides were like an iron curtain under the push of the out-of-control ocean currents. They rose and fell one after another, roaring towards the land that was silent in the long night. However, at the edge of the land, something was slowly rising. The hazy and blurry outline was projected in the night, but the sense of existence was so strong. It was as if only that mark was the core of the entire world, the meaning of all life and existence, and the destination of all things destruction. Countless pitch-black tsunamis surged and roared. When they collided with each other, an earth-shattering roar erupted. However, all the loud sounds were suppressed by the low sound of drums. They gradually shattered and became difficult to hear. That was someone stepping on the ground, taking light and vigorous dance steps. Above the sky, the dark clouds shattered. An array of pure moonlight shone down, illuminating the half-naked middle-aged man. His face was covered in oil paint, solemn and ancient. His curly long hair fell from his shoulders, swaying like the darkness itself. At this moment, the wind howled, and the sound of a flute was actually played. In the raging sea, there was the sound of waves spreading like the pious praise of souls. He was dancing, circling and stepping on the empty beach, as if he was imitating the former great god, reappearing his divine might. No, that was the great God himself, the reflection of the former divine being in the world. When he danced, all living things were intoxicated by this figure that contained endless profundities, endless ascetic practices, and prayers spread through his every movement. Unknowingly, the waves of the sea slowly stopped. But he still didn't stop. His eyes were lowered. He just danced in a daze, as if he would never stop. It wasn't just here. It wasn't just here. East Asia, the Russian Federation, Egypt, Rome, America, India. After the sun set, the world that sank into the dark side was still full of noise and turmoil. Under the push of an invisible hand, the waves of disaster spread in the world behind the high wall, triggering layers of ripples of decay. But outside the high wall, there was still endless darkness rising. On the endless sea, the distant outline from the abyss gradually became clear. Under the depth, black sails fluttered, and a ferocious hull made of bones, and the fingernails of the dead broke through the shackles. Countless ships of the dead dragged ropes, and their journey never ended. In the deep tide, the Najilfa fleet slowly rose. Just like this, they dragged the huge fallen country from the dark side of the abyss and gradually floated up. On the other side of the border, it was dark. Like a layer of dark clouds, the eternal thunderclouds shrouded the huge palace like a living creature riding the tide. Just passing by, they cast a shadow that covered the sky and the sun between hell. Above the black clouds, thousands of streaks of lightning spread out like meridians, constantly flapping. They were like wings of lightning stirring up hell, resisting the pull from the abyss. Under the will of the dwarf kings, the Sea of Thunder spread its wings and soared, flying toward the present. There were also bizarre giant fishes swaying their bodies, forming a colorful and majestic torrent. They kept converging like a school of fish that followed the ocean currents in search of reproduction. Wherever they passed, they would plant their own seeds between the layers of hell, using calamity to hatch endless offspring. Then, they were all devoured by the mouth of the abyss that chased after them. The pitch-black holy light rose from the depths of the abyss, and the hymns from the blessed land spread between the disasters. The outline of the rancher's temple appeared in the observation mirror. There was more. Countless faces tore at each other. A distorted monster formed by layers of tails of giant rats, an endless sea of flowers that was enchanting and beautiful, and more. Countless hells collided with each other in the tide, and endless darkness floated up from the abyss. They could not wait to crawl. Up. They were roaring and singing fervently. They were marching toward the world that was favored by light. The silent stage was finally about to welcome a new performance. And in the deepest part of hell, at the end of the layers of labyrinths, on the throne in the shadows, the thinker with 10,000 eyes bowed his head and looked at everything with a smile. Just like the audience in the first-class seats, he waited quietly. However, occasionally, his gaze would shift to another direction, landing on the scar that was filled with fog, and his gaze would become playful and curious. This was a rare pastime in the past. Before everything officially began, there was still a good show to watch. And how would the actors who came on stage, under the mockery of fate, choose? However, it was still too slow. The rhythm was too slow, and there was always a little bit more to go. The Pied Piper smiled, raised a finger, and pointed. He gave a revelation to his jester. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.